My name is Sloan. I am 30 years old, and until then I thought I was married to a brilliant medical tech CEO. His wife and son are inside, the young secretary sneered, physically blocking the heavy oak door to my husband's executive office. She expected tears. Instead, I calmly covered my 5-year-old daughter's ears, stepped into a quiet alcove, and called my brother. Tear the Aspen house apart, I ordered, before marching back and kicking that door wide open. I was the silent venture capitalist who secretly owned the very building we were standing in. Before I tell you how I dismantled his life in hours, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to destroy someone who mistook your generosity for weakness. It was our anniversary, and I had planned the perfect afternoon surprise. I picked up our daughter Emma early from her private kindergarten in Manhattan. She clutched a messy hand-drawn card adorned with glitter and crooked hearts, practically vibrating with excitement to see her father. Gavin, my husband of 6 years, was the charismatic face of a rapidly growing medical technology startup. He spent his days giving interviews, shaking hands with wealthy investors, and playing the visionary founder. He loved the spotlight, and I preferred the quiet shadows pulling the invisible strings and managing the capital that kept his entire operation afloat. We stepped off the private elevator onto the top floor of his company headquarters. The glass walls, sleek modern furniture, and panoramic views of the city skyline screamed ultimate success. Emma happily skipped ahead of me down the hall toward the executive suite, but our path was abruptly cut off. Vanessa, Gavin's personal secretary, stepped from behind her desk and blocked the hallway. She wore a tight, inappropriate dress that violated several strict corporate dress codes, and she was staring at me with sheer contempt. "You cannot go in there right now," Vanessa said, crossing her arms and looking down at my daughter Emma with a very dismissive glare. "Excuse me," I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. "It is our anniversary. I am here to see my husband." Vanessa let out a sharp, mocking laugh. She leaned in closer, her voice dripping with venom. "His wife and son are inside." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Any normal woman might have screamed. She might have collapsed onto the polished hardwood floor, demanded answers, or engaged in a loud shouting match with a secretary who clearly thought she held all the power. But I am not a normal woman. I am a venture capitalist. I evaluate risks, calculate liabilities, and execute hostile takeovers for a living. I do not do hysterics, I do asset management. As I looked into Vanessa's smug face, a cold, absolute clarity washed over my entire body. What Vanessa did not know, what no one in this office knew except my elite legal team, was that Gavin did not own a single brick of this company. He thought he was a self-made titan of industry. The reality was that my venture capital firm had secretly funneled the seed money through a series of shell companies to fund his dream. I had purchased this entire commercial building under a limited liability company, completely controlled by me, simply to keep his overhead costs low and stroke his massive ego. He was playing executive in my sandbox. I looked down at Emma. Her brow was furrowed in confusion, sensing the sudden drop in temperature, but not quite understanding the raw hostility of the woman blocking our path. I knelt down gently, placed my hands over her small ears, and gave her a reassuring smile. "Wait right here for 1 second, sweetie," I murmured. I stood up, stepped backward into a quiet, soundproof alcove near the conference rooms, and ignored my incoming emails and hit the speed dial for my older brother Wyatt. At 32 years old, Wyatt was a former Marine who now ran one of the most ruthless and efficient private security firms on the East Coast. He answered on the first ring. "Wyatt," I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal register. "I need you to deploy your best team right now." "Give me the target," Wyatt responded, immediately recognizing my serious tone. "Gavin's Aspen property," I commanded. It was a sprawling luxury ski chalet I had purchased entirely with my own trust fund, though Gavin had begged me to let him manage it to feel like the provider for our family. "I want you to head up there right now. Tear it apart." "Consider it done," Wyatt said, ending the call quickly, no questions asked. I slipped my phone back into my designer bag, the icy calm solidifying into pure, focused rage. I walked back toward the executive suite, my heels clicking sharply against the floorboards. Vanessa saw me coming and tried to stand her ground, opening her mouth to protest loudly. I did not even look at her. I simply shoved her out of the way with my shoulder marching straight past her desk. I reached the heavy oak door of Gavin's office. I did not knock. I raised my foot and kicked the door wide open, the heavy wood slamming violently against the glass partition. The scene inside was worse than anything I could have ever imagined. Gavin was pressed against his mahogany desk, passionately kissing a woman I had never seen before. She looked about 32 years old with an air of arrogant entitlement. But the true gut punch was not the infidelity. It was the little boy sitting on the leather sofa in the corner. He looked to be exactly 7 years old, holding a gaming tablet. As the door slammed open, the boy looked up, his eyes widening in sudden alarm. "Dad," the young boy called out, staring directly at my husband. The silence in the room stretched for a fraction of a second before Gavin practically leaped away from the woman. He hastily straightened his expensive Italian silk tie, his face draining of color, before morphing into a mask of righteous indignation. He ignored the young boy who had just called him father. Instead, he pointed a shaking finger at the woman standing next to him and launched into a frantic, desperate defense, ignoring the sheer absurdity of his lies. He told me to calm down, lowering his voice to that smooth, practiced tone he used to charm venture capitalists and angel investors. He insisted I was overreacting in front of our daughter. According to his rapidly spinning narrative, this woman was Chelsea, a severely unstable former client who had somehow bypassed the lobby security protocols and forced her way into his private executive office. He claimed she had brought a random child off the street just to extort him for a massive corporate settlement. He stepped toward me, reaching out to place a reassuring hand on my shoulder, but I stepped back, keeping my body between him and Emma. He told Emma to look away from the crazy lady, treating his own secret family like intruders. I felt Emma squeeze my hand tighter, seeking comfort from the sudden tension radiating through the room. I did not blink. I did not shout or shed a single tear. I simply stared at the pathetic man I married, watching him dig his grave with every fabricated syllable that spilled from his mouth. Chelsea did not look like a crazy former client. She looked perfectly comfortable standing there in a cashmere sweater and designer boots that my venture capital funds had undoubtedly paid for. She watched Gavin scramble with a look of pure amusement. Then she let out a sharp, mocking laugh that bounced off the glass walls of the executive suite. She did not shrink back or act ashamed. She reached into her handbag, slowly pulled out a folded piece of heavy parchment paper, and stepped right up to me, boldly invading my personal space. She shoved the paper directly into my line of sight. It was an official marriage certificate from the state of Nevada. The date printed clearly on the document was exactly 8 years ago. That was 2 full years before Gavin stood at an altar with me in front of hundreds of people and promised me his life. Chelsea smiled a venomous, triumphant smile, looking me up and down with absolute pity. "I am his legal wife," she said, her voice loud enough to echo down the hallway, where Vanessa the secretary was listening and laughing at my expense. "We never divorced. You are just his ATM sweetheart, a temporary bank account he used to build his empire." The words should have destroyed me. They should have dropped me to my knees in agonizing heartbreak. But my brain did not process this revelation as emotional trauma. My brain processed this as a massive, catastrophic legal liability. Bigamy. The word flashed in my mind like a neon warning sign in the dark. Under United States federal and state law, you cannot be legally married to 2 people at the same time. My entire 6-year marriage to Gavin was completely void from inception. It legally never existed. I was entirely legally unattached to the man standing in front of me. As my eyes rapidly scanned the intricate details, the county clerk's signatures, and the official state seals on the marriage certificate, Gavin watched my face closely. He saw the exact moment the legal reality settled over me. And surprisingly, he did not look ashamed anymore. His panicked expression quickly shifted into a cold, arrogant smirk. He realized the massive legal loophole he had just accidentally uncovered. He took a confident step toward me, his chest puffed out, radiating unearned superiority. He looked at me with a sickeningly triumphant glint in his eye. He stated that since our marriage was legally invalid from the very beginning, the ironclad prenuptial agreement we had aggressively negotiated and signed 6 years ago was completely null and void. He arrogantly assumed this gave him a backdoor to claim half of my venture capital assets. He confidently declared that his high-priced lawyers would argue we were business partners who cohabitated, allowing him to seize 50% of my entire investment portfolio, my real estate holdings, and my offshore accounts. He actually smiled, looking at Chelsea, and then back at me, genuinely believing he had just won the ultimate corporate lottery. He stood in the middle of the office I had secretly bought for him, wearing a bespoke watch I had purchased, and boldly promised that he was going to take half of everything I had ever built. I looked at this man, marveling at his absolute delusion. He truly thought he was the smartest person in the room. He thought he had outmaneuvered a woman who dismantled hostile corporations before breakfast. He thought he had trapped me in an inescapable legal nightmare that would leave me financially ruined and publicly humiliated across the entire American tech industry. Without breaking eye contact, Gavin reached under his massive mahogany desk and pressed the hidden emergency panic button. He looked at me with dead, empty eyes, dropping the charismatic facade completely. He coldly stated that I was currently trespassing on his private corporate property, demanding I leave. He announced that he was calling the building security team to forcefully escort me and my crying daughter out of his company immediately. He turned his back on me, placing a protective hand on Chelsea's waist and giving his secret son a reassuring nod, acting as if I was already a forgotten problem. He thought the armed men in uniform arriving at the elevators were going to do his bidding and violently throw me out into the cold street. He had absolutely no idea what was about to happen to him. Gavin stood with his back to me, his hand resting comfortably on the small of Chelsea's back. He was the picture of unearned confidence, waiting for the inevitable arrival of the building security team to drag his problems out of sight. He smirked down at the little boy on the couch, whispering something reassuring. The distinct chime of the private executive elevator echoed down the long glass hallway. Heavy, synchronized footsteps approached the office. These were not the soft, hesitant shuffles of the underpaid lobby guards Gavin expected. The heavy oak door swung completely open, revealing 4 men in dark tactical gear. They wore fitted black uniforms, utility vests, and carried an undeniable air of lethal authority. They were heavily armed private contractors. They were Wyatt's best operators. Gavin turned around, his arrogant smile widening as he pointed a manicured finger directly at me. He ordered the men to physically remove the trespassing woman and her child from his executive suite immediately. He demanded they use whatever force was necessary to clear his office. The 4 towering men stepped into the room, their boots planted firmly on the plush carpet. They did not look at me. They did not move toward me. They looked directly at Gavin. The lead operator, a man with cold steel eyes and a jagged scar along his jawline, crossed his arms over his tactical vest. Gavin barked the order again, his voice rising in pitch as his frustration grew. He reminded them that he was the chief executive officer and they worked for him. The lead operator simply shook his head, his expression completely blank. He informed Gavin that they did not work for the startup. They worked for the building's holding company, and the holding company was entirely owned by me. Gavin's face contorted in absolute sheer confusion. His brain simply could not process the sudden shift in power. He opened his mouth to argue, but the lead operator stepped forward, invading Gavin's personal space. The operator extended a gloved hand and issued a direct, non-negotiable command. He demanded Gavin's executive keycard, his building access fob, and his company-issued phone. Chelsea gasped, pulling her son closer to her as the reality of the situation began to penetrate her arrogant facade. Gavin stammered, demanding to know what was happening, but the security team offered no explanations. 2 other contractors stepped out into the hallway and approached Vanessa's desk. Through the glass walls, I watched the arrogant secretary freeze in terror as the armed men confiscated her computer, her security badge, and the master keys to the executive floor. The illusion of Gavin's empire was crumbling in real time. I looked down at Emma, giving her hand a gentle, reassuring squeeze. I did not exchange another word with the man who had just destroyed our family. I did not need to. I turned on my heel and walked out of the office with icy, untouchable dignity. The security operators formed a protective perimeter around me, and my daughter escorting us safely to the private elevator. As the steel doors began to close, the shock finally wore off, and Gavin's absolute panic set in. He lunged out of his office, his face red with rage, screaming vicious threats down the hallway. He yelled that he would ruin me, that his lawyers would tear my venture capital firm to shreds, and that he was entitled to half of my entire fortune. The elevator door slid shut, cutting off his frantic screaming, leaving him trapped on a floor he could no longer control. I bypassed my corporate office entirely and directed my private driver to take us straight to my secure downtown penthouse. The residence was a fortress of glass and steel occupying the top 2 floors of a heavily guarded tower. It was the one place where I knew Emma would be completely insulated from the fallout. As soon as we stepped through the front doors, my longtime nanny whisked Emma away to the playroom with the promise of movies and fresh snacks. The heavy silence of the penthouse settled around me, but I was not alone for long. Sitting at my massive marble dining table was my sister-in-law, Jada. At 31 years old, Jada was a force of nature. She was a brilliant, fiercely loyal African-American corporate lawyer and one of the most ruthless forensic accountants in the country. She was also Wyatt's wife, which made her family. Jada did not deal in emotions or hypotheticals. She dealt in undeniable facts, hidden ledgers, and buried offshore accounts. She was dressed in an immaculate emerald green power suit, her expression dead serious as she gestured for me to sit down. Resting on the marble table in front of her was a thick leather briefcase already unclasped. Jada pushed a perfectly organized stack of financial records, bank statements, and wire transfer logs across the table toward me. She did not offer me a sympathetic hug or ask me how I was feeling about my husband's betrayal. She knew I needed a war plan, not a shoulder to cry on. "I tracked the money," Jada said, breaking the heavy silence. "Every single dime he touched since you signed the initial funding agreements." I sat down, bracing myself for the financial damage. I assumed Gavin had been siphoning off my capital to buy Chelsea her expensive clothes, her luxury vehicles, and her quiet compliance. I had fully expected to see a few stolen thousands scattered across his various personal bank accounts. Jada tapped a glossy, heavily redacted document right at the center of the table. She looked me dead in the eyes and dropped a massive, earth-shattering bombshell. Gavin had not just been supporting his secret wife with stolen petty cash. He had actively and illegally diverted millions of dollars of my venture capital funding to set up an untraceable offshore trust fund in the Cayman Islands. And the sole named beneficiary of that stolen fortune was his illegitimate son, Hunter. I stared at the offshore account numbers glowing brightly on Jada's tablet. The betrayal was no longer just an emotional wound. It was a calculated multi-million-dollar federal crime. Gavin had stolen from our daughter's future to secure a luxurious safety net for his secret, illegitimate life. I felt a dangerous calmness settle deep into my bones. But while Jada and I were busy uncovering the vast depths of his financial treason inside my secure penthouse, my brother Wyatt was 2,000 miles away, executing the exact brutal consequences of that treason. The scene of my immediate retaliation was shifting far away from the glass skyscrapers of Manhattan to the pristine snow-covered peaks of Aspen, Colorado. Nestled at the base of the mountains was a sprawling 10,000-square-foot luxury ski cabin. Gavin loved to parade this specific property around as the ultimate crown jewel of his personal success. He constantly used it to host lavish corporate retreats, schmooze high-net-worth investors, and post endless photos of the grand timber and glass architecture on his social media. What he conveniently forgot or arrogantly chose to ignore in his narcissistic delusion was the underlying legal paperwork. Because my marriage to him was legally void due to his bigamy, standard marital property laws did not apply to us in any capacity. The cabin belonged 100% to my limited liability company. It was my singular asset, and Gavin's secret family had just drastically overstayed their welcome. 3 matte black SUVs tore up the freshly plowed private driveway, their heavy winter tires crunching aggressively against the packed ice. Wyatt stepped out of the lead vehicle, his breath pluming in the freezing, thin mountain air. He was flanked by 6 elite operators from his private security firm, all built like absolute tanks and completely numb to the freezing temperatures. They moved with military precision. They did not bother knocking. Wyatt bypassed the complex digital security keypad, entirely utilizing the master administrative override code I had provided him directly from the holding company. The heavy custom front doors swung violently open, bringing a sharp blast of freezing winter wind into the heavily heated pine-scented foyer of the luxury estate. Chelsea and her son Hunter had fled straight to the Aspen cabin immediately after their humiliating removal from the executive office in New York. She had wrongly assumed this mountain fortress was a safe haven, untouchable by my reach. They were lounging comfortably by the massive stone fireplace wrapped in thick wool blankets when Wyatt marched directly into the great room. Chelsea jumped up, her face twisting into a mask of pure entitled rage. She demanded to know who they were and threatened to call Gavin to have them all thrown in federal prison. Wyatt did not even flinch. His expression remained carved from stone. He calmly pulled a thick official stack of legal documents from his tactical jacket and dropped them heavily onto the glass coffee table. He looked her dead in the eye and informed her that she had exactly 10 minutes to vacate my private corporate property before she would be forcefully and physically removed for trespassing. When Chelsea adamantly refused to move, screaming hysterically that she was the true legal wife, and this was her family home, Wyatt simply gave his team the visual signal. They executed the tear-it-apart order with absolute ruthless efficiency. The security operators completely bypassed the child and went straight for the massive master suite. They emerged moments later carrying massive armfuls of Chelsea's exorbitant VC-funded wardrobe. Cashmere sweaters, custom silk dresses, and tens of thousands of dollars in limited-edition luxury handbags were hauled straight out the front door. Chelsea shrieked in absolute horror as Wyatt's men marched onto the pristine front lawn and began dumping her entire designer life directly into the freezing wet snow. Rare Birkin bags plummeted into the icy slush. Custom Prada winter boots were tossed carelessly into deep snowbanks. Expensive velvet accent furniture was dragged out and left entirely exposed to the biting, relentless mountain wind. Frantic and shivering violently in the open doorway, Chelsea pulled out her cell phone and dialed the local police dispatcher, hysterically reporting a violent home invasion and robbery in progress. 2 Aspen police cruisers arrived just minutes later, their emergency lights flashing brightly against the blinding white snow. The officers stepped out of their vehicles, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts, fully expecting to walk into a dangerous, violent domestic dispute. Chelsea immediately ran toward them, playing the helpless victim perfectly. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger at Wyatt and demanded he be handcuffed and thrown in a jail cell immediately. Wyatt calmly walked down the snowy front steps to meet the responding officers. He did not raise his voice or show any signs of aggression. He simply handed the lead officer the official property deeds, the voided marriage documentation, and the trespassing orders signed by a judge just hours prior. The officers reviewed the paperwork carefully, their expressions shifting instantly from high alert concern to strict, annoyed authority. The lead officer turned back to Chelsea, holding up a hand to cut off her continuing hysterical rant. He firmly told her the paperwork was ironclad. The property belonged entirely to a corporate entity she had no ties to, and she was currently committing criminal trespassing. He warned her that she had 2 simple choices. She could gather whatever personal items she could carry and walk off the property immediately, or she could be arrested, placed in handcuffs, and spend the night in a freezing local holding cell. Defeated, humiliated, and shaking uncontrollably from the freezing wind, Chelsea grabbed her son's hand and dragged him down the icy driveway, leaving the ruined remnants of her stolen luxury life buried deep in the snow. Back in my secure downtown penthouse, the silence of my war room was suddenly shattered. My personal phone began to ring loudly across the marble table. The caller ID flashed a name I had not expected to see so soon. It was my father-in-law, Thomas. I answered the call, bringing the phone to my ear, and before I could utter a single greeting, his voice exploded through the speaker. He was screaming at the top of his lungs, his voice thick with furious rage, viciously cursing me for throwing his true firstborn grandson out into the freezing cold. I did not utter a single word in response to Thomas and his frantic screaming tirade. I simply pulled the device away from my ear, pressed the glowing red button, and tossed it onto the solid marble table in front of Jada. The sheer audacity of the man was staggering. He was not calling to apologize for his son's federal fraud. He was not calling to ask how his granddaughter Emma was handling the destruction of our family. He was screaming at me for protecting my own financial assets. I looked at Jada, the offshore banking documents still spread between us in the secure penthouse. I told her to keep tracing the offshore accounts. I had an immediate errand to run. I grabbed my coat and took the private elevator down to the garage. My personal driver navigated the armored luxury SUV out of the city and straight toward the affluent manicured suburbs of Westchester County. The drive took less than an hour, but freezing winter weather had already painted the upscale neighborhoods in thick coats of white snow. Thomas and Patricia lived in a sprawling multi-million-dollar estate. It was a massive, ostentatious house featuring towering white pillars and a sweeping circular driveway designed specifically to showcase wealth. As my vehicle glided to a smooth stop near the front walkway, I could see warm golden light spilling from the massive bay windows of their living room. I did not bother ringing the doorbell. I used the heavy brass key I had carried on my ring for 6 years, unlocking the mahogany front door and pushing it open. The foyer was silent, but the crackling sound of a massive wood-burning fireplace echoed from the main living room. I walked down the hallway, my boots silent on the plush Persian runners. I stepped into the wide archway of the living room and found a scene that could have been ripped straight from a twisted dark holiday greeting card. Chelsea and her son Hunter were sitting on the expensive velvet sofa right in front of the fire. Patricia, my mother-in-law, was affectionately draping a thick cashmere blanket over Chelsea's shivering shoulders. Thomas was warmly handing the 7-year-old boy a steaming mug of hot cocoa, patting his head with unmistakable grandfatherly pride. They had immediately taken in the very woman who had actively participated in a massive fraud against me. They did not notice me standing in the archway at first. I cleared my throat, a sharp sound that shattered their cozy domestic illusion. All 4 heads snapped in my direction. Chelsea shrank back into the sofa cushions, pulling the blanket tight around her neck. Thomas stood up, his face flushing with the same red anger he had exhibited on the phone. But it was Patricia who took the lead. My mother-in-law did not look guilty. She stood up, smoothing her impeccable silk blouse, and looked at me with absolute unfiltered disdain. The polite, wealthy suburban matriarch mask dissolved, revealing the calculating, ruthless woman underneath. Patricia crossed her arms and took a step toward me, her voice dripping with sheer venom. She told me I had no right to burst into their home after what I had done to her family. I asked her exactly what she meant by family, gesturing casually to the woman sitting on the couch. Patricia did not flinch. She coldly stated that Chelsea was the one who held the true business bloodline of their family. She looked me up and down, sneering, as she delivered the ultimate devastating blow. She declared that I was never truly part of their inner circle. She claimed I was just a convenient puppet they used to get Gavin his initial startup capital. They had tolerated my presence simply to secure the venture capital funds. And then she said the one thing that guaranteed her absolute destruction. She looked at me with dead eyes and stated that my daughter Emma was not even a priority to this family anymore, not when they had a true firstborn male heir sitting on the couch. A lesser woman would have broken down. A lesser woman would have screamed, cried, or begged for a reason why her own daughter was being discarded by her grandparents. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice or offer a dramatic response to her toxic monologue. I simply stared at her, feeling my heart turn into a block of solid ice. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my phone. I did not break eye contact with Patricia as I logged directly into my secure corporate banking application. I navigated straight to the executive asset portal. With my thumb, I tapped 3 specific buttons on the screen, authorizing an immediate freeze on all secondary corporate accounts linked to their names. Thomas scoffed loudly, asking what I thought I was doing, playing on my phone while Patricia was speaking. He demanded I leave the property before he called the authorities. I finally smiled, a cold, sharp expression that made him take a hesitant step backward. I told him he might want to hold off on calling the police, considering what was happening outside. Right on cue, the heavy mechanical grinding of a commercial diesel engine echoed through the thick front windows. A massive tow truck with flashing yellow strobe lights was aggressively reversing up their pristine, snow-covered circular driveway. The heavy steel hook was already lowering, sliding directly beneath the front chassis of Thomas's prized custom-ordered Porsche. Thomas gasped, rushing toward the bay window in absolute horror. Patricia shrieked, demanding to know what I had exactly done. I locked my phone and slowly slipped it back into my tailored coat pocket, my voice radiating absolute, unquestionable authority. I calmly revealed that the luxury sports car and Patricia's platinum credit cards were strictly registered under my corporate name, and their free ride was officially over forever. The heavy diesel engine of the commercial tow truck roared to life, drowning out the frantic, indignant shrieks of my former mother-in-law. Patricia clutched her useless, deactivated platinum credit cards against her chest, her face pale and contorted with an ugly mixture of rage and sudden, absolute powerlessness. Thomas stood frozen in the snow, his mouth hanging open in sheer disbelief as he watched the steel cables haul his pristine, custom-ordered Porsche out of his driveway and into the freezing winter night. I stood perfectly still on their front porch, the icy wind whipping around me, watching the flashing yellow strobe lights reflect off the snowbanks as my corporate property was rightfully reclaimed. Chelsea and her son huddled together on the living room sofa, visible through the bay window, entirely forgotten by the two people who had just proclaimed them the true business bloodline of the family. The illusion of their untouchable suburban royalty had been shattered in under 5 minutes. As the tow truck turned onto the main road and disappeared from sight, a modest silver rental sedan abruptly pulled into the freshly cleared space in the driveway. The doors unlocked with a sharp chirp. Gavin stepped out into the harsh winter elements. He was not driving his usual luxury vehicle, undoubtedly a consequence of Jada already locking him out of the primary transportation accounts. He adjusted the collar of his designer wool coat, stepping over the icy tracks left by the departing tow truck. He glanced briefly at his shivering parents on the porch and the chaotic scene unfolding in their home, but he did not rush to comfort them. Instead, his eyes locked entirely on me. He did not look like a man whose secret offshore accounts had been discovered or whose mountain retreat had just been raided. He approached me with a slow, measured stride, his face stretched into a sickeningly smug, arrogant smile that made my stomach turn. He looked like a man who believed he had just played the ultimate winning card in a high-stakes game. He stopped at the base of the porch steps, perfectly comfortable in the freezing wind, radiating an aura of absolute, unearned victory. Without a word of greeting, he reached inside the breast pocket of his coat and pulled out a thick, legally bound stack of papers. He slapped the document directly against the wooden railing of the porch right in front of me. The official seal of a New York State judge stamped on the front page caught the glow of the porch lights. I looked down at the paperwork, keeping my expression entirely neutral. Gavin leaned casually against the railing, crossing his ankles, eager to explain his brilliant maneuver. He loudly announced that he had just come from a closed-door emergency hearing. He bragged about filing an ex parte motion, bypassing my legal team entirely. He had painted a very specific, highly damaging picture for the presiding judge. According to his fabricated sworn testimony, I was currently experiencing a violent, catastrophic mental breakdown. Gavin proudly listed the evidence he had presented to the court. He cited my sudden, unprovoked eviction of a woman and child into the freezing aspen snow. He pointed to the aggressive confiscation of corporate vehicles and the rapid freezing of executive credit cards. He framed my swift, calculated asset protection as the erratic, dangerous actions of a deeply unstable woman intent on destroying her own company out of sheer paranoid delusion. Because of this carefully spun narrative, Gavin happily informed me that the judge had granted an immediate emergency injunction. The order temporarily froze all of my personal banking accounts, suspended my access to my private wealth, and supposedly placed a hold on my executive powers to protect the company from my violent mental instability. He smiled genuinely, believing he had completely neutralized my financial warfare by cutting off my personal resources and painting me as a lunatic. But Gavin was not finished. He stepped up onto the porch, invading my personal space, just as Chelsea had done hours earlier in my office. The smug smile faded, replaced by a look of pure, venomous cruelty. He lowered his voice, ensuring his parents could not hear the viciousness of his next threat. He leaned in so close I could feel his breath against my cheek. He whispered that the frozen bank accounts were just the beginning. He promised me that he was going to use this official court record of my supposed violent mental breakdown to rip Emma away from me. He stated that no judge in the country would grant custody to a mother with a documented history of severe psychological instability. He vowed to take full custody of our daughter, lock me away in a psychiatric facility if I tried to fight back, and leave me utterly alone, penniless, and stripped of everything I had ever loved. He wanted to break me down to absolutely nothing. I looked into the eyes of the man I had married, seeing the bottomless void of his narcissism fully exposed. He expected me to shatter. He wanted me to scream, to lash out, to strike him right there on the porch so he could use the security cameras to further prove his fabricated claims of my violent insanity. So I gave him exactly the performance he demanded. I let my shoulders drop, releasing the rigid posture I had maintained all evening. I widened my eyes, forcing a look of absolute crushing panic to wash over my face. I let my breath hitch, taking a slow, trembling step backward, putting distance between us, as if I was terrified of his power. I looked at the court document, then back at him, projecting total, absolute defeat. I did not say a single word. I turned away, wrapping my coat tightly around my supposedly trembling frame, and walked quickly down the snowy path toward my waiting armored SUV. Gavin laughed out loud, a harsh, victorious sound that echoed through the freezing air, thoroughly convinced he had just won the war. My driver opened the heavy door, and I slid into the warm leather seat, keeping my head bowed until the door clicked shut. The SUV instantly pulled away from the curb, leaving Gavin standing triumphant in the snow. The moment the vehicle cleared the neighborhood gates, my trembling stopped completely. My shoulders straightened, and the mask of a terrified, defeated woman vanished instantly. I pulled my phone from my pocket, the screen already glowing in the dark cabin. I tapped a single contact name and waited for the secure line to connect. Jada picked up on the first ring. I stared out the tinted window at the passing winter landscape, my voice calm, steady, and utterly ruthless. He took the bait, I said. Initiate the war room protocol. The armored SUV navigated through the treacherous, icy streets of Westchester and merged onto the interstate, speeding directly toward the heart of the financial district. I sat in the spacious back seat, watching the city skyline grow larger against the dark winter night, feeling the adrenaline of the impending strike pumping through my veins. The terrified, trembling woman Gavin thought he had broken on his parents' snowy porch no longer existed. That performance had served its exact purpose. It had given him the false sense of absolute security required to make his final, fatal mistake. My driver pulled into the secure underground parking garage of Jada's elite corporate law firm. I bypassed the main lobby and took the private elevator straight to her floor. I did not step into a standard legal office. I stepped into a high-tech command center. Jada had converted her massive corner suite into a digital war room. The walls were lined with glowing, oversized monitors displaying real-time data streams, network access logs, and live security feeds. 3 of her top forensic analysts were typing furiously at their workstations in the background. Jada was sitting at the center console, her fingers flying across a sleek glass keyboard, illuminated by the harsh blue light of the screens. She did not look up as I approached, simply pointing a manicured finger at the central monitor. She informed me that Gavin had wasted absolutely no time. Armed with his fraudulently obtained emergency injunction, he had confidently marched right past the building's lobby guards and let himself back into the startup's executive offices. Because the holding company security team was forced to temporarily comply with the judge's official seal, Gavin currently had physical access to the building. But physical access meant nothing in the digital age. Through the network backdoors Jada and Wyatt had secretly established during the initial raid, we had an unrestricted high-definition view of his desktop screen. We watched in absolute silence as Gavin frantically attempted to lock down the primary company servers, desperately trying to lock out my holding company. When that failed, his true motive became glaringly obvious. He initiated a massive unauthorized data transfer, attempting to download the entirety of the company's proprietary medical technology intellectual property onto a series of encrypted external hard drives. He was actively communicating with a rival biomedical firm in Silicon Valley, trying to illegally sell the very algorithms my venture capital money had funded. Suddenly, a bright red alert flashed across Jada's secondary monitor, signaling a massive outbound communication. Gavin had just authorized a company-wide email blast. It was sent simultaneously to all 400 employees, the entire board of directors, and every single one of our primary investors. Jada intercepted the email and projected the text onto the main wall. I read the desperate, venomous words he had typed. Gavin was taking the psychological warfare he had threatened me with and broadcasting it to the entire industry. He officially framed me as a delusional, jealous former client who had developed a dangerous, obsessive fixation on him. He claimed that I had recently suffered a violent psychotic mental breakdown, resulting in my current attempts to aggressively dismantle his legitimate, thriving business. He blatantly lied to his staff, stating that I had fabricated a fake marriage to extort him and ruin his real family. He ended the long, rambling email by ordering all employees to completely ignore any directives coming from my holding company, assuring them that my personal assets were frozen and the courts were actively handling my severe mental instability. Jada read the final paragraph, let out a sharp, genuine laugh, and shook her head at his sheer stupidity. She minimized the defamatory email and pulled up a digitized copy of the original venture capital funding contract we had aggressively negotiated and signed 6 years ago. It was a massive, incredibly dense document filled with complex legal jargon and impenetrable corporate clauses. Jada swiftly scrolled past the standard operational agreements and zoomed in directly on page 42. She highlighted a deeply buried, meticulously worded paragraph that I had personally insisted on including. It was the ultimate corporate trap, commonly known in our circles as a poison pill. I knew Gavin intimately even back then. I knew his staggering arrogance meant he would never bother to read the fine print of a 100-page document before blindly signing his name to secure millions in funding. The poison pill clause was devastatingly simple but entirely lethal. It explicitly stated that in the event the founding chief executive officer committed any act of gross moral turpitude, deliberately engaged in corporate espionage, or was found to be involved in the specific act of bigamy, the contract triggered an immediate non-negotiable dissolution of all his executive powers. It did not require a lengthy board vote or a drawn-out courtroom trial. The clause legally mandated that upon triggering those specific breaches, the founder instantly and automatically forfeited all company equity, all voting rights, and every single executive protection he possessed. His shares did not just freeze. They legally evaporated, dissolving directly back into the ownership of my venture capital firm. Gavin had just provided us with undeniable digitally recorded proof of corporate espionage by attempting to steal the medical intellectual property, and Chelsea had already kindly provided the official legal proof of his bigamy. Jada looked up at me, her eyes shining with cold, calculated anticipation. She asked for my final verbal confirmation. I stared at the live feed of Gavin sitting in the office I had paid for, trying to steal the technology I had built, and I gave her the nod. Jada turned back to her terminal. Her fingers moved with lethal precision as she bypassed his futile server locks. She did not need to fight him in court. She simply needed to enforce the contract he had signed. With 3 short, elegant lines of custom code and her encrypted digital authorization, she executed the poison pill. We watched the results unfold in glorious real time on the monitors. Gavin's entire executive profile was systematically wiped from the corporate registry. His title of Chief Executive Officer was legally and digitally eradicated. The access portals to all company banking accounts slammed shut instantly, locking him out of millions in operating capital. The payroll system triggered an automatic freeze on his exorbitant salary, and on the live security camera feed from his office, I watched Gavin freeze in absolute terror as his computer monitors flashed red before going completely dark, and the screen of his company-issued cell phone went entirely black. The glowing monitors in the war room cast long, cold shadows across Jada's face as she closed her primary terminal with a sharp, satisfying click. We had just digitally decapitated Gavin. The absolute silence that followed the execution of the poison pill was a testament to total victory. I was walking toward the mahogany sideboard to pour 2 glasses of celebratory bourbon when my secondary burner phone began to vibrate violently against the marble counter. I glanced at the caller ID, expecting a frantic, threatening text from Gavin using a borrowed device. Instead, it was an unknown local number. I swiped to answer, raising the phone to my ear without speaking. I was met with the jagged, heavy, wet sounds of someone on the verge of a total respiratory panic attack. It took me a few seconds to recognize the high nasal pitch beneath the hysterical sobbing. It was Vanessa, the same arrogant, fiercely gatekeeping secretary who had laughed in my face and physically blocked my path just days ago, was now weeping into the receiver, desperately begging for 5 minutes of my time. I let her cry for a full minute, savoring the absolute devastating reversal of our positions. She babbled incoherently about locked glass doors, bouncing vendor checks, and frozen corporate payroll systems. The digital guillotine had clearly severed her lifeline right alongside Gavin's. I coldly told her to pull herself together, gave her a specific address, and ended the call. I chose a discreet, dimly lit cafe located on the extreme outer edge of the financial district. It was a quiet establishment, favored by old money and private conversations far removed from the shiny, transparent glass architecture of the tech startup world Gavin inhabited. I arrived 15 minutes early, securing a secluded corner booth shielded by heavy velvet curtains. I ordered a black coffee and waited. When Vanessa finally walked through the brass-trimmed doors, she was entirely unrecognizable. The immaculate designer pencil skirts and her aura of superior, unearned authority were completely gone. She wore a wrinkled, oversized trench coat, her hair was unkempt, and her eyes were violently red and swollen. She slid into the leather booth opposite me, her hands shaking so severely she had to interlock her fingers and press them flat against the table to keep them still. I did not offer her a drink or a single syllable of comfort. I simply sat back and waited for her to speak. Vanessa stared at the scarred wooden table, taking a ragged, uneven breath before the pathetic truth began to spill out of her. The absolute devastation of the poison pill had hit the ground floor of the startup like a localized earthquake. She explained that Gavin had stormed out of his office after the screens went black, screaming like a madman at the IT department to fix a network blackout they could not even access. When the employees realized the entire payroll system was suspended and their access badges no longer functioned, sheer chaos erupted. But Vanessa's panic ran much deeper than a missed paycheck. She looked up at me, dried mascara flaking around her eyes, and confessed that she had tried to use the corporate expense card Gavin had given her to book him a discreet hotel room for the night. The card was declined. She then tried his personal black card. Declined. Every single financial artery tying him to the world had been severed, but the financial ruin was only the prelude to her true underlying desperation. Vanessa leaned across the table, looking over her shoulder, before lowering her voice to a desperate, raspy whisper. She told me she was not just a loyal employee following bad corporate orders. Her voice cracked as she confessed that she had been sleeping with my husband for the better part of 2 years. I stared at her, feeling a brief, microscopic flash of surprise that instantly morphed into cold, detached amusement. Gavin's depravity truly had no floor. The logistical nightmare of his narcissism was staggering. He was actively juggling me a secret bigamous wife, raising a child in the suburbs, and the secretary guarding his office door. Vanessa began to sob again, explaining the incredibly twisted, manipulative narrative Gavin had spun to secure her absolute, unquestioning loyalty. He had promised her that Chelsea was nothing more than a historical mistake, a temporary, annoying nuisance he was carefully managing. He had sworn to Vanessa that once he fully secured my venture capital millions and completely legally isolated the offshore funds, he was going to discard both me and Chelsea simultaneously. He had promised to marry Vanessa, elevating her from the reception desk to the penthouse. She had blocked my path that day not just out of strict corporate duty, but because she genuinely believed she was protecting her future husband and her promised fortune. The sheer blinding delusion of it all was almost sad. I watched this broken, terrified woman finally realize she was just another disposable pawn in Gavin's sociopathic chess game. Now that the money was gone and the grand illusion shattered, Gavin had immediately turned his vicious temper on her. When the credit cards declined, he had cornered her in a stairwell and screamed in her face, blaming her for the technical failure, completely oblivious to the fact that his empire was permanently gone. Vanessa knew that when the legal dust finally settled, she would be heavily implicated in his financial mess. She was terrified of going to a federal penitentiary for the corporate funds she had blindly helped him launder into the Cayman accounts. She looked at me with wild, desperate eyes, pleading for mercy, begging for a deal that would grant her immunity from the coming storm. I looked at her without an ounce of pity. I calmly informed her that mercy was incredibly expensive and tears held absolutely zero currency with me. Vanessa swallowed hard, her throat visibly bobbing. She reached deep into the pocket of her oversized coat and pulled out a small, heavily encrypted silver USB drive. She placed it carefully on the table and slowly slid it across the wood until it rested perfectly in front of my coffee cup. She wiped her eyes and whispered that the drive did not just contain the old financial ledgers or offshore routing numbers Jada already possessed. It contained explicit, undeniable, and highly classified proof of a massive catastrophic federal crime Gavin was actively preparing to commit by midnight to save himself. I stared at the silver flash drive resting against the dark wood of the cafe table. It looked entirely unassuming, a simple piece of metal and plastic, yet Vanessa's violently trembling hands indicated it was the equivalent of a live, unpinned grenade. I slid the drive into my coat pocket, stood up without offering a single parting pleasantry, and left the terrified woman sitting alone in the velvet booth with a strict instruction to wait for my call. Within 20 minutes, my driver had navigated back to the secure underground garage, and I was stepping back into the harsh blue-lit hum of Jada's command center. I tossed the drive directly onto the central marble console. Jada did not hesitate or ask unnecessary questions. She immediately plugged the device into an isolated air-gapped terminal to prevent any embedded malware from compromising her firm's primary network. Her fingers flew across the glass keyboard, swiftly bypassing Vanessa's rudimentary passwords and instantly pulling up a hidden directory of heavily classified corporate folders. We leaned in together, watching the oversized monitors populate with thousands of scanned PDF documents, encrypted bank statements, and internal wire transfer logs. It took Jada less than 5 minutes of intense forensic scanning to unearth the colossal, catastrophic scope of Gavin's endgame. He had not just been siphoning my venture capital to fund his secret bigamous life with Chelsea and their son. He had crossed a hard, unforgivable line into devastating federal territory. Jada pulled up a series of heavily guarded, highly restricted governmental grant applications. Gavin had quietly applied for and successfully secured $10 million in federal funding, explicitly earmarked for advanced medical research and development. The funds were meant to accelerate the proprietary technology my firm had backed. Instead, the money had never even touched the startup's operational accounts. Jada traced the complex routing numbers, her jaw tightening in disgust as she followed the digital breadcrumbs. Gavin was systematically embezzling the entire $10 million, slowly funneling the federal money through a convoluted maze of anonymous shell corporations directly into a newly established, deeply buried offshore account in the Cayman Islands. He was actively stealing from the United States government. But the sheer financial magnitude of the theft was not the most horrifying revelation. Jada opened the master grant application, expanding the final page of the document across the massive central monitor. There, resting at the very bottom of the binding federal contract, was my exact digital signature. Gavin had bypassed the standard legal protocols, utilized his previous access to my executive credentials, and flawlessly forged my authorization on every single federal document. I stared at my stolen signature, the cold, calculating brutality of his plan washing over me in absolute, undeniable clarity. He was not just stealing the money to build a new empire in the shadows. He was meticulously framing me for the entire $10 million heist. He knew the sudden failure of the startup and the missing funds would trigger a massive, unavoidable federal audit. His entire plan hinged on fleeing the country with the stolen government cash, abandoning his failing startup, completely discarding Chelsea and his secret son, and vanishing with Vanessa into the islands. He intended to be sipping expensive cocktails on a pristine beach while the FBI kicked down the heavy oak doors of my venture capital firm, dragging me away in handcuffs to face decades in a federal penitentiary for massive corporate fraud and government embezzlement. He had engineered the perfect, devastating escape hatch, leaving me to burn in the ashes of his destruction. I did not panic. I did not scream or shatter under the weight of his sociopathy. I felt a terrifying, absolute calm settle deep in my bones, hardening my resolve into pure steel. I looked at Jada, a silent, lethal communication passing between us instantly. We did not need to fire Vanessa or destroy her life. We needed to turn her into our greatest asset. I picked up my secure phone and dialed the burner number I had forced Vanessa to purchase at a convenience store earlier that evening. When she answered, her voice was a trembling, fragile whisper waiting for the executioner's blade to fall. I laid out the terms of her survival with icy, uncompromising precision. I told her that I now held all the evidence required to send both her and Gavin to federal prison for the rest of their natural lives. However, if she followed my exact instructions without fail, she would walk away completely untouched. I instructed her to return to Gavin immediately. She was to play the role of the devoted, panic-stricken secretary perfectly. I told her to wipe her tears, walk right back into his office, and soothe his violently bruised ego. Her singular mission was to convince him that the temporary network lockout was just a minor glitch, a desperate, futile attempt by my legal team to slow him down. She needed to encourage him to finalize the offshore transfer immediately tonight to secure their promised future together. But the crucial caveat, the absolute linchpin of our entire counterattack, was that she had to ensure he executed the final $10 million wire transfer directly from his personal unsecured laptop, not the company servers. It would irreversibly tie his personal IP address directly to the federal theft, leaving a permanent digital footprint that no lawyer could ever erase. Vanessa agreed instantly, sobbing her complete, unwavering allegiance to my directives. She was choosing her own freedom over a man who had lied to her from the very beginning. I hung up the phone, watching Jada prepare the digital tripwires that would capture Gavin's personal IP address, the exact second he initiated the fraudulent transfer. The trap was flawlessly set. He was about to digitally execute himself, sealing his own fate with his own arrogant hands. I turned away from the glowing monitors, feeling the satisfying, icy thrill of impending victory. Then a sharp, blaring alarm erupted, shattering the focused, predatory silence of the war room. It was not a network alert or a financial trigger. It was a custom, high-priority notification blaring directly from my personal cell phone. I snatched the device from the marble counter, my blood running instantly cold, the thrill of victory evaporating in a millisecond. The alert was a verified emergency notification from the secure application linked directly to Emma's elite private kindergarten. A bright, glaring red banner flashed violently across my screen. The school's head of security had just triggered a lockdown protocol. Someone entirely unauthorized, lacking the proper clearance codes and matching identification, was aggressively attempting to pick up my daughter. The glaring red banner on my phone screen felt like a physical blow to my chest. The carefully constructed ice in my veins instantly evaporated, replaced by a primal, blinding surge of maternal panic. I did not waste a single second explaining the situation to Jada. I bolted from the marble counter, sprinting out of the high-tech war room and down the long glass corridor of the law firm. My heels slammed against the polished floor as I yelled for my security detail to mobilize. Jada shouted after me, her voice cutting through the ringing in my ears, promising she would immediately lock down the legal front and handle the local authorities. I threw myself into the waiting armored SUV before my driver even had the chance to fully open the heavy steel door. I barked the address of Emma's elite private academy, demanding he ignore every traffic law and speed limit between the financial district and the affluent residential neighborhood. The ride was an agonizing blur of flashing streetlights and blaring horns. I gripped the leather armrest, my knuckles turning white, visualizing every possible catastrophic scenario. Gavin had promised to rip my daughter away from me on his parents' snowy porch, but he was currently trapped in his office executing a fraudulent wire transfer. This meant he had sent a proxy. He had sent his secret wife to do his dirty work. The heavy vehicle screeched to a halt in the manicured circular driveway of the prestigious kindergarten. I did not wait for the security guards to assist me. I shoved the heavy door open and hit the pavement running. The academy was a fortress of wrought iron gates and security cameras designed specifically to protect the children of the city's wealthiest elites. But standing right outside the heavily fortified main entrance was a scene of absolute chaotic desperation. Chelsea was furiously waving her arms, aggressively arguing with the headmistress and the school's armed security guard. Her normally polished suburban facade was completely gone. Her hair was frantic, her designer coat was thrown on haphazardly, and her face was contorted into a vicious, ugly sneer. She was screaming at the top of her lungs, wildly claiming to be a legally authorized guardian and demanding they release Emma into her immediate custody. The headmistress stood firm, gripping a clipboard to her chest, repeatedly stating that Chelsea was nowhere on the approved security registry. I did not shout her name. I did not announce my presence. I simply strode up the concrete walkway and physically inserted myself directly between Chelsea and the heavy oak doors of the school. I turned my back to her for a fraction of a second to meet the terrified eyes of the headmistress, giving her a sharp, definitive nod. The administrator immediately understood, stepping back and locking the reinforced doors from the inside, securing my daughter completely out of reach. Only then did I pivot to face the woman who had dared to come for my child. Chelsea gasped, stumbling backward in her expensive boots, as she finally realized I was standing right in front of her. The false bravado she had attempted to project against the school staff instantly melted into defensive panic. But the sheer greed and desperation driving her actions quickly overrode her fear. She squared her shoulders, jutting her chin out in a pathetic display of dominance. Chelsea snarled, pointing a manicured finger at my chest. She completely abandoned any pretense of politeness or civility. Her voice was shrill, echoing across the empty parking lot as she issued her extortion demand. She declared that Gavin had promised her the multi-million-dollar Aspen retreat, and she was entirely unwilling to walk away empty-handed after years of hiding in the shadows. She brazenly demanded that I immediately transfer the deeds of the mountain estate directly into her name. If I surrendered the luxury property, she promised to get back in her car, drive away, and leave Emma completely alone. She actually believed she held a position of leverage. She thought threatening a mother with the kidnapping of her own child was a brilliant negotiation tactic to secure a real estate portfolio. I stared at her, marveling at the staggering depths of her stupidity. She was attempting to blackmail a venture capitalist who had just mathematically destroyed her husband's entire existence. A lesser woman might have resorted to a screaming match right there in the school courtyard. I might have slapped her across the face or engaged in a desperate, undignified physical brawl. I did absolutely none of those things. I maintained my cold, untouchable composure, letting her hyperventilate and expose her own pathetic desperation. I slowly unclasped my leather handbag. Reaching inside, my fingers brushed against a thick, legally binding document Jada had handed me just 30 minutes prior. My sister-in-law had fully anticipated Gavin's collateral attacks and had swiftly utilized her formidable legal connections. I pulled out the crisp paperwork complete with the fresh, undeniable ink of a judge's signature. I calmly extended my arm and pressed the emergency restraining order directly against Chelsea's chest. She flinched instinctively, grabbing the paper before it could fall to the ground. Her eyes darted across the bold black text, reading the strict legal mandate that required her to remain 500 feet away from me, my residence, and my daughter's school at all times. The reality of the document crushed her extortion attempt instantly. Chelsea looked up from the restraining order, her lips trembling as the undeniable weight of her legal peril began to sink in. She opened her mouth to stutter a defense, but I stepped deeply into her personal space, completely dominating her presence. I did not raise my voice. I leaned in close, bringing my lips inches from her ear, delivering a whisper that hit with the destructive force of a sledgehammer. I told her that she was wasting her time fighting for a snowy cabin when she was about to lose her freedom. I calmly revealed the fatal truth she had been completely blind to. I whispered that Gavin was not just cheating on me. He was also actively sleeping with Vanessa, the young corporate secretary. I let that agonizing betrayal register on her face before delivering the final lethal blow. I informed her that Gavin was currently sitting in his office, finalizing the theft of $10 million in federal grant money. He was preparing to flee to the Cayman Islands with Vanessa by midnight, leaving Chelsea stranded in Westchester. And as a final parting gift, Gavin had carefully routed all the initial embezzled funds through Chelsea's personal suburban businesses, effectively framing her for massive, unavoidable federal tax evasion. I watched the blood completely drain from her face as she realized she was not the mastermind of a grand extortion plot, but the designated scapegoat about to take the fall for a federal crime. The blood completely drained from Chelsea's face, leaving her perfectly contoured features looking like cracked porcelain under the harsh security lights of the school courtyard. She stood absolutely frozen, her mouth slightly parted, unable to form a single coherent syllable as the devastating reality of my words tore through her delusions. For a suspended moment, the only sound between us was the distant hum of traffic from the main avenue. Then the inevitable wave of suffocating paranoia crashed over her. She violently shook her head, her perfectly styled hair falling into her eyes as she took a frantic step backward. She aggressively denied everything, her voice rising in a shrill, breathless panic, accusing me of spinning a desperate, malicious lie to protect my assets. She insisted Gavin loved her, that he was moving the money for their shared future, that I was simply a bitter, discarded wife trying to poison her victory. I did not offer a single word of argument. I simply watched with cold, clinical detachment as she ripped open her designer handbag. Her hands were shaking so violently that her keys and lipstick spilled onto the concrete, clattering loudly in the quiet parking lot. She ignored the mess, snatching her phone and jabbing at the screen with frantic, uncoordinated strikes. She was calling Gavin. She desperately needed her puppet master to answer the phone to soothe her rising terror and to assure her that the grand plan was still entirely intact. I stood perfectly still, listening to the faint, rhythmic ringing emanating from her phone speaker. It rang once, twice, 3 times. Then the impersonal, automated tone of Gavin's voicemail echoed through the cold air. Chelsea gasped a sharp, ragged intake of breath and immediately hit redial. I watched her spiral, knowing exactly why my husband was not answering his most prized possession. He was currently trapped in his executive office, desperately trying to manage a spectacular multi-front disaster. He was aggressively placating a terrified, weeping Vanessa, attempting to secure the young secretary's absolute loyalty, while simultaneously trying to bypass Jada's network roadblocks to execute a $10 million federal theft. Chelsea's frantic calls were an annoying, poorly timed distraction, he could not afford to entertain. Her second call went straight to voicemail. Then her third. The arrogant, untouchable facade she had worn to blackmail me evaporated entirely, leaving behind a terrified, utterly exposed woman who suddenly realized she was standing alone on the tracks of an oncoming train. She lowered the phone, her hand trembling violently against her side. She looked at me, her chest heaving, the denial warring with the absolute horrifying logic of my accusation. She demanded proof. She demanded to see the evidence of this supposed betrayal, her voice cracking as she tried to maintain a final shred of leverage. I calmly reached back into my leather handbag. I did not possess a shred of pity for her, but I understood the undeniable power of hard physical data. I pulled out a single folded sheet of high-resolution paper that Jada had meticulously prepared before I left the command center. I extended my arm, holding the document steady in the cool wind. Chelsea snatched it from my fingers, her eyes darting frantically across the page. It was a stark, beautifully unarguable screenshot. The top half displayed the newly established Cayman Islands offshore account, clearly highlighting the routing numbers linked directly back to the shell corporations Gavin had set up using Chelsea's suburban business credentials. It was the exact financial death warrant that would invite the federal government to completely dismantle her life. But the bottom half of the document held the true fatal poison. It was a confirmed non-refundable flight itinerary. 2 first-class tickets, departing from a discreet private airfield at exactly midnight tonight. The passenger names were printed in stark, unapologetic black ink. Gavin and Vanessa. There was no ticket for Chelsea. There was no ticket for their son. I watched the exact second 8 years of manipulation, secrecy, and toxic promises shattered into dust. The mistress who genuinely believed she was the ultimate prize, the woman who thought she had successfully conquered my life, finally understood her true pathetic function. She was nothing more than a convenient temporary incubator for the son Gavin always wanted. She had been used as a suburban placeholder, a quiet hidden corner of his narcissistic empire, and ultimately she was his designated disposable shield. He had expertly groomed her to absorb the entire shockwave of a massive federal tax evasion scandal, while he escaped to an island paradise with a younger, more compliant version of her. Tears of genuine, terrifying clarity began to stream down Chelsea's face, ruining her makeup. She dropped the paper onto the concrete, her hands moving to cover her mouth to stifle a sob. The sheer, blinding scale of the betrayal had broken her completely. She looked up at me, her eyes wild and desperate. The hostility was entirely gone, replaced by the raw, primal terror of a mother realizing she was about to lose everything. She had a son, Hunter, whose entire future was now directly tied to a mother facing decades in a federal penitentiary. The maternal instinct to protect her child finally overrode every ounce of her remaining pride and greed. She swallowed hard, wiping her face with the back of her trembling hand, and asked me what she needed to do. She surrendered completely, agreeing to turn on Gavin without hesitation. She offered to hand over every suburban financial record, every hidden ledger, and every piece of communication that linked him to the shell corporations. She pledged to testify, to cooperate, to become the ultimate weapon against the man who had orchestrated her ruin, so long as I guaranteed she and Hunter would survive the coming federal storm. The enemy of my enemy had just become my most valuable, devastating asset. I accepted her total surrender with a slow, calculating nod, instructing her to return to her vehicle and await further highly specific instructions. The final stage of the digital guillotine was now perfectly set, but executing the absolute flawless destruction of Gavin's empire required a physical convergence. I needed to lure him out of his corporate fortress and into a controlled environment where the final fatal blow could be delivered directly to his face. I needed him to believe right up until the very last second that he still held the upper hand. I pulled my secure cell phone from my pocket and dialed his direct number. I closed my eyes, expertly modulating my breathing, slowing my heart rate, and channeling a lifetime of corporate discipline into a single masterful performance. As the call connected, I let out a shuddering, broken breath. I faked a tearful, defeated, completely shattered voice, begging my husband for a peace treaty. The line clicked, and Gavin answered on the second ring. His voice was sharp, breathless, and laced with a toxic layer of adrenaline. He aggressively demanded to know why I was calling him during a critical network failure, his tone implying I was nothing more than an irritating distraction. I did not snap back or rise to his hostility. Instead, I let out a carefully calibrated, shuddering breath. I forced my voice to tremble, allowing a pathetic, defeated whimper to slide through the receiver. I told him he had won. I told him the sheer paralyzing terror of the corporate blackout and the absolute fear of losing Emma had finally broken me. Gavin, I cried, perfectly cracking his name in half. I cannot fight you anymore. I am completely done. You win. Complete silence descended on the line. Then the distinct, sickening sound of a deeply satisfied exhale crackled through the speaker. I pushed the performance further, leaning heavily into the fragile, hysterical housewife trope he had always secretly wanted me to embody. I told him the stress was destroying my physical health and my sanity. I babbled frantically about my venture capital firm, telling him I was ready to walk away from all of it just to make the nightmare stop. I offered him the absolute crown jewel of my professional life. I promised to sign over my majority-controlling shares of the entire portfolio. I told him I would surrender all executive rights, relinquish all financial claims, and walk away quietly into the suburbs with our daughter, provided he just stopped his attacks and left us in peace. He laughed. It was a dark, guttural, immensely arrogant sound that scraped painfully against my ear. He was completely intoxicated by his own perceived brilliance. The raw narcissism flowing through his veins blinded him to any logical red flags. He did not pause to question why an apex predator was suddenly rolling over and showing her soft underbelly. He simply accepted my absolute surrender as his natural, inevitable due. Gavin began to gloat, his voice dripping with heavy condescension. He told me he always knew I lacked the true, ruthless stamina required for top-tier corporate warfare. He bragged about how easily he had outmaneuvered my entire legal team, dismissing my network blackout as a pathetic temporary nuisance that his superior intellect was already overriding. He called me fragile. He told me I was far too emotional, too maternal, and too attached to pathetic ethics to ever truly play in his league. He painted himself as a corporate god, untouchable and victorious. I swallowed down the violent surge of bile rising in my throat and forced another wet, submissive sob into the receiver. I asked him how we could finalize the surrender tonight. I noted the sharp spike of desperate eagerness in his voice when he agreed to a meeting. His mind was clearly hyper-focused on the midnight flight to the Caymans he thought was still waiting for him. He needed my legal binding surrender to ensure his offshore accounts remained permanently untouched by my firm's auditors after he vanished. He forcefully demanded I bring the transfer deeds directly to his office. I softly refused, injecting just enough lingering panic into my voice to make the refusal believable. I told him I was too terrified to step foot in his building, suggesting a neutral, brightly lit location where I felt safe signing my life away. I proposed Jada's high-end corporate law office in the financial district. I told him my sister-in-law was weeping alongside me, drafting the total surrender and non-disclosure agreements right now because we were both so thoroughly beaten. Gavin actually scoffed at the mention of Jada, his arrogance hitting a fever pitch. He told me to have the paperwork printed and ready in exactly 1 hour. He wanted to walk right into my sister-in-law's formidable firm, look my high-priced, defeated lawyer in the eye, and watch me sign over my entire empire. He agreed to the location, completely unaware he was happily marching directly into a reinforced steel trap. The exact second the call disconnected, my entire physical demeanor shifted violently. I was sitting in the back of my armored SUV, speeding away from Emma's school and rocketing back toward the city center. The pathetic trembling in my hands ceased instantly. The manufactured tears dried cold on my cheeks, leaving behind a face carved from absolute unforgiving stone. I stared out the tinted window at the blurring city lights, my mind running through the final lethal calculations of the evening. The transition from weeping victim to cold-blooded executioner was seamless. My driver pulled into the secure underground parking garage of Jada's building, the tires squealing slightly on the polished concrete. I stepped out of the vehicle, my posture straight, my stride long and predatory. I rode the private glass-walled elevator up to the top floor, the doors sliding open to reveal the familiar hyper-focused energy of the command center. Jada was standing at the head of the massive mahogany conference table, her screens glowing brilliantly in the dim light. Next to her stood Wyatt, our lead forensic investigator, a man whose quiet, menacing presence was a testament to his lethal efficiency in dismantling corporate criminals. Wyatt gave me a brief, sharp nod, confirming that Gavin's personal IP address had just successfully pinged the offshore Cayman servers. I did not need to speak. I walked into the room making dead-level eye contact with both of them. The fake surrender was complete. The bait had been swallowed whole, and the monster was currently driving himself straight to the slaughterhouse. Jada did not smile, but a dangerous, predatory glint illuminated her dark eyes. She reached down to the center of the heavy wooden table and picked up a thick, heavy manila folder. She held it up under the harsh blue-tinted security lights, presenting the final nail in Gavin's coffin. Stamped across the center of the heavy paper bound by thick, tamper-evident red tape was the official unmistakable seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The heavy gold-embossed seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation seemed to absorb all the light in the room, acting as a grim promise of the absolute devastation we were about to unleash. I did not need to say a single word to Jada or Wyatt. We simply took our positions around the massive mahogany conference table, transforming the elegant glass-walled boardroom into a polished execution chamber. The ambient lighting was dimmed just enough to make the city skyline outside feel like a distant, irrelevant world. I sat at the absolute head of the table, my posture immaculate, my hands resting lightly over the thick stack of printed documents placed perfectly in front of me. I wore a tailored slate-gray blazer, a deliberate armor of absolute control. The digital clock on the wall shifted to exactly 9 o'clock. Right on schedule, the heavy glass doors of the boardroom swung open. Gavin strode into the room exuding a noxious, overpowering wave of completely unearned victory. He was practically vibrating with toxic adrenaline, his chest puffed out, an arrogant, wolfish grin plastered across his face. He had meticulously styled his hair and wore a custom Italian suit, clearly dressing for the role of the conquering king, stepping up to claim his newly surrendered empire. But the true depth of his cruelty was revealed by the people trailing closely behind him. He had not come alone to quietly accept my supposed defeat. He had brought an audience. His parents, Thomas and Patricia, walked into the room flanking their son like aging, heavily manicured bodyguards. Patricia's eyes immediately locked onto me, her face twisting into a triumphant, deeply condescending smirk. She adjusted her pearls, looking down her nose as if she were inspecting a particularly disappointing stain on the carpet. Thomas stood beside her with his arms crossed, projecting a false patriarchal authority, clearly reveling in the sight of the woman they had always secretly despised, finally being brought to heel. They had come to watch me bleed. Gavin had clearly fed them a highly sanitized, incredibly distorted version of reality, convincing them that I was a hysterical, fragile wife simply folding under the pressure of his superior intellect. They had no idea they were standing in a federal kill box. Gavin did not bother with pleasantries. He bypassed the empty leather chairs lining the table and marched directly toward me, slapping his hands down flat on the polished mahogany wood. He leaned over, invading my personal space, trying to physically intimidate me with his proximity. He demanded the pen. His eyes were wide, practically salivating as they dropped to the thick stack of papers resting under my hands. He genuinely believed that those crisp white pages represented the total unconditional transfer of my entire venture capital portfolio, the complete surrender of my executive rights, and the absolute forfeiture of my personal wealth. He was so blinded by his own narcissistic greed that he did not even bother to read the bold, stark lettering printed across the very first page. Patricia let out a soft, theatrical sigh from the doorway, loudly complaining that they were missing a dinner reservation at their favorite upscale bistro and demanding we hurry this pathetic little surrender along. Thomas chuckled a dry, grating sound, agreeing with his wife while giving Gavin an encouraging nod. He told his son to wrap it up so they could go celebrate his newfound total financial independence. Gavin snapped his fingers at me, holding his hand out expectantly, demanding I hand over the contract and the pen so he could sign his name and finalize his absolute dominance over my life. He was completely drunk on the illusion of his own victory, already mentally spending the millions he thought he had successfully stolen. He scoffed, telling me to stop wasting his valuable time and just sign away the rights to my firm so he could finally be rid of my dead weight. I looked up at him, my expression perfectly blank, an icy void that offered absolutely zero comfort or submission. I did not tremble. I did not cry. I did not display a single ounce of the broken, terrified woman I had pretended to be on the phone just an hour prior. As Gavin aggressively reached across the wood to snatch the heavy silver fountain pen resting near my fingertips, I moved with calm, lethal precision. I smoothly pulled the thick stack of documents backward, sliding them safely out of his reach. Gavin's hand grasped empty air. He froze, his arrogant smirk faltering for a fraction of a second, a flash of genuine confusion crossing his face as he processed my unexpected resistance. He opened his mouth, likely to issue a vicious threat or a loud, embarrassing demand. But before he could force a single syllable past his teeth, I reached into the pocket of my blazer and retrieved a small, sleek black remote control. I kept my eyes locked dead onto his, letting him see the cold, unyielding predator hiding just beneath the surface of his supposedly fragile wife. Without breaking eye contact, I pressed the primary button. Behind me, the massive state-of-the-art projector screen quietly descended from the ceiling, blazing to life, with a brilliant, undeniable glow that illuminated the entire darkened boardroom. The soft whir of the projector was the only sound in the room, as the high-resolution display populated with stark, terrifying data. The screen did not display the asset transfer documents he so desperately craved. It did not show the complete surrender of my wealth or the dissolution of my firm. Instead, the massive display was split into two very distinct, highly classified sections. The left side of the screen featured his official, legally binding, and completely irrevocable termination notice, outlining the immediate seizure of his entire corporate standing for gross negligence and criminal breach of fiduciary duty. But it was the right side of the screen that contained the true fatal poison. Jada had routed a direct, secure feed straight from the offshore Cayman Islands banking servers. The screen displayed a live, real-time feed of the deeply buried, heavily encrypted account Gavin had meticulously set up to catch his $10 million in stolen federal funds. And right there, in glaring, inescapable red numbers, the account balance blinked back at him. It read exactly $0.00. The absolute silence in the boardroom was shattered by the sound of Gavin's sudden violent inhalation. He stumbled backward, his highly polished leather shoes skidding against the thick carpet, his eyes bulging as he stared at the digital zeros illuminating the massive screen. The blood drained from his face so fast, he appeared almost translucent under the harsh security lights. His meticulously crafted facade of a conquering king dissolved instantly into the frantic, hyperventilating panic of a cornered animal. He lunged forward, slamming his fists onto the mahogany table, screaming at the top of his lungs that I had absolutely no legal authority to freeze his assets. His voice cracked, pitching upward into an undignified, shrill shriek as he frantically reached into his tailored jacket pocket. He ripped out a crumpled, hastily printed document and waved it wildly in my face. He shrieked that he possessed a court-mandated injunction, a flawless legal shield that supposedly prevented my firm from auditing his internal communications or restricting his personal wealth transfers. He was hyperventilating now, spittle flying from his lips, as he desperately clung to the illusion that his counterfeit legal maneuver held any weight in the real world. He yelled that my actions were illegal, that I was bluffing, and that his money was completely secure. I did not even blink at his pathetic display of fake legal force. I simply leaned back in my chair and looked toward the shadows near the back of the room. Jada stepped forward, moving with the slow, deliberate, and icy authority of a seasoned apex predator who had finally cornered her prey. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Her mere presence instantly sucked the remaining oxygen out of the room. She glided to the edge of the conference table and dropped a massive, heavily bound forensic accounting dossier onto the polished wood. The heavy thud echoed like a gavel striking a sound block demanding absolute obedience. Jada looked down at Gavin, her dark eyes devoid of a single shred of human sympathy. She informed him that his fake injunction was not worth the paper it was printed on, casually noting that the corrupt judge he thought he had bribed was currently sitting under a massive federal investigation of his own. Then she opened the dossier. She methodically walked Gavin and his increasingly horrified parents through the absolute massacre of his financial existence. She detailed every single stolen dime, reciting the exact timestamps, the hidden ledger entries, and the routing numbers of his fraudulent wire transfers. She pulled out high-resolution scans of his forged signatures, completely dismantling his clumsy attempts to bypass corporate security protocols and authorizing illegal capital drains. She did not stop there. Jada ruthlessly presented the undeniable digital footprint of his crimes, reading aloud the exact IP addresses that traced the attempted $10 million federal theft directly back to Gavin's personal encrypted laptop sitting in his home office. The trap was absolute. Every digital breadcrumb he thought he had erased had been meticulously gathered, categorized, and weaponized against him. He was mathematically and legally trapped. Thomas and Patricia had been standing like statues, their earlier triumphant smirks completely wiped away, replaced by slack-jawed, suffocating terror. They were slowly realizing that the son they worshipped was not a brilliant corporate mastermind, but a sloppy, desperate criminal, about to be buried under a federal indictment. Patricia clutched her husband's arm, her knuckles white, her expensive pearls trembling against her collarbone. She weakly attempted to interrupt her voice, a fragile, trembling whisper, insisting there had to be some sort of gross misunderstanding. She desperately claimed that Gavin was a good man who simply needed a standard business loan to cover his temporary legal fees, begging Jada to see reason. Jada turned her lethal gaze toward my former in-laws, and I watched the final illusion of their perfect, affluent suburban life evaporate into nothingness. Jada did not soften the blow. She looked Patricia dead in the eye and delivered the fatal truth. She pulled a separate, brightly colored folder from the stack and slid it across the table until it rested right in front of Thomas. She coldly informed them that the massive high-interest business loans Gavin had recently secured to pay for his elite defense attorneys were not backed by his corporate salary or any legitimate business assets. They were secretly secured using his parents' entire retirement portfolio and the deed to their pristine, fully paid-off suburban home as collateral. The realization hit Thomas like a physical strike to the chest. He gasped, staggering sideways and heavily bracing himself against the glass wall of the boardroom as all the air left his lungs. Patricia let out a high, wounded keen, covering her face with her hands as the devastating reality sank into her bones. Their golden boy had not just ruined his own life, he had quietly, methodically, and remorselessly gambled away their entire financial future to save his own skin. Gavin had leveraged the very roof over their heads to fund his sinking ship. If the federal government seized his assets, which they undoubtedly would, the bank would immediately foreclose on his parents' sprawling estate. They were completely, irreparably ruined, destined to spend their twilight years facing total bankruptcy and public humiliation because of the son they had taught to be ruthless. Gavin spun around, his eyes wild and desperate, looking at his parents with a sick, pleading expression. The confident executive was completely gone, replaced by a terrified child caught in a monstrous lie. He opened his mouth, stuttering frantically, trying to weave one last lie, one final desperate manipulation to convince them he had a master plan to fix this catastrophic failure. He took a step toward his father, reaching out with trembling hands, begging them to just trust him for a little while longer, promising he would get the money back. Before he could utter another pathetic excuse, the heavy glass doors of the conference room swung open with a sharp, definitive click. The electronic lock disengaged, allowing a blast of cold air from the hallway to sweep into the heated boardroom. Every head in the room snapped toward the entrance. Gavin froze his outstretched hand, dropping limply to his side as all the remaining color drained from his face. Standing in the doorway framed by the dim lights of the corridor was Chelsea. Her designer coat was still thrown hastily over her shoulders, her hair slightly windblown from the manicured courtyard of the academy. But the frantic, hyperventilating desperation she had displayed earlier was entirely gone. She stepped into the room, her posture rigid, her eyes locked dead onto Gavin. She was no longer the manipulated hidden mistress waiting patiently in the shadows for a mountain retreat. She was a furious, utterly betrayed woman who had just realized she was the designated scapegoat for a federal crime, and she was glaring daggers directly at the man who had orchestrated her execution. Chelsea did not simply walk into the conference room. She invaded the space like a sudden violent shift in atmospheric pressure. The heavy glass doors swung shut behind her, sealing the boardroom with a definitive click. Gavin stumbled backward, his mouth opening and closing in soundless shock as he stared at the woman he had meticulously kept hidden in the suburbs for 8 years. His parents, Thomas and Patricia, shrank back against the glass wall, utterly bewildered by the sudden appearance of this furious stranger. They had expected to watch me surrender my corporate empire, not witness the arrival of a secret family that completely shattered their pristine illusion of their son. Without uttering a single syllable of greeting, Chelsea marched directly toward Gavin. Her boots struck the hardwood floor with a harsh, militaristic rhythm. Reaching deep into the folds of her oversized coat, she produced a thick, tightly bound stack of legal documents. With a guttural sound of pure, unadulterated disgust, she hurled the heavy stack directly into his chest. The sharp corner of the binding struck his sternum with a loud smack before the pages cascaded down, scattering across the polished mahogany table and fluttering to the floor. Gavin scrambled awkwardly to catch them, his eyes darting across the bold black legal headers. It was an aggressive, uncompromising divorce filing. Jada's elite associates had drafted it in record time, weaponizing every ounce of leverage Chelsea possessed. The clauses were absolute, demanding immediate sole physical custody of their son, the immediate freezing of all hidden suburban assets, and maximum punitive alimony. But the true devastation lay in the signature block representing her counsel. She was now fully backed by the unlimited, ruthless financial power of my personal legal team. I was bankrolling his utter destruction from every conceivable angle. The reality of the paperwork struck Gavin like a physical blow. His eyes darted wildly around the room, frantically searching for an exit, a loophole, or a vulnerable target. He locked onto Chelsea, instinctively defaulting to the toxic charm and psychological manipulation he had used to control her for nearly a decade. He stepped toward her, raising his hands in a placating, deeply patronizing gesture. He pitched his voice low, injecting it with a sickeningly sweet tone of manufactured desperation. He begged her to listen to reason, spinning a frantic, improvised lie right there in front of his horrified parents. He claimed the Cayman offshore account was actually meant for them, that the zero balance on the projector screen was merely a temporary banking error, and that I was simply a bitter, discarded wife trying to turn them against each other to steal Hunter's inheritance. He promised her the multi-million-dollar Aspen retreat, swearing that if she just ripped up the divorce papers and walked out of the room with him, they could still execute their grand plan and leave me with absolutely nothing. It was a pathetic, transparent display of a cornered manipulator rapidly running out of lies. Before Chelsea could even open her mouth to reject his nauseating performance, a secondary door leading to Jada's private adjoining office clicked open. The sound was deafening in the tense, pressurized silence of the boardroom. Wyatt reached out and pushed the heavy wooden door wide. Stepping out from the shadows of the adjacent room was Vanessa. The young corporate secretary looked completely different from the terrified, weeping girl Gavin had left in his executive suite earlier that evening. Her posture was rigid, her face was scrubbed clean of makeup, and her eyes held the cold, detached resolve of someone who had just narrowly escaped a burning building. Gavin physically recoiled, literally stumbling over his own scattered divorce papers, as he registered Vanessa's presence in the room. He raised a trembling finger, attempting to issue an executive command, but the words died in his throat. Vanessa ignored him entirely. She walked straight to the center of the conference table and dropped a heavy silver company laptop directly onto the polished wood. It hit the surface with a loud, definitive crack. She did not look at Gavin when she spoke. She looked directly at Jada, her voice echoing clearly across the massive room. She stated for the official record that the device contained the master decryptions for every single one of Gavin's hidden email servers. She coldly confirmed that she had voluntarily handed over his entire shadow ledger, the forged signature authorizations, and the absolute proof of the embezzled federal grant money. Then she turned her gaze to Gavin, delivering the final fatal blow. She announced that she had also surrendered the first-class non-refundable flight records to the Cayman Islands. The tickets he had booked solely for himself and her, fully intending to abandon Chelsea and his son to face the wrath of the federal government for his massive tax evasion. The boardroom descended into a suffocating, absolute silence. The grand illusion of Gavin's untouchable superiority was entirely permanently shattered. He was completely surrounded, mathematically isolated, and legally condemned. I watched the last remaining shreds of his carefully curated facade disintegrate, peeling away to reveal the hollow, pathetic coward underneath. He looked to his left and saw the secret wife he had hidden and abused for 8 years, now armed with a lethal divorce decree and backed by limitless capital. He looked to his right and saw the young, naive mistress he had groomed to be his accomplice, now standing as the primary witness for his federal prosecution. And standing directly in front of him was me, the powerful venture capitalist. He had vastly underestimated the woman who had methodically orchestrated his total annihilation. He was trapped in a cage built entirely by his own narcissism, surrounded by the 3 women he had so arrogantly believed he could manipulate and discard. A terrifying animalistic sound tore from his throat. It was not a word, but a visceral scream of pure, unfiltered, narcissistic rage. The realization that his entire life was completely over, that his parents were financially ruined, his fortune was gone, and federal prison was an absolute certainty, triggered a violent, explosive psychological snap. He completely lost all connection to reality. His eyes went entirely dark, dilating with blinding, murderous fury. He lunged backward, his hands locking onto the heavy, solid brass frame of a leather conference chair. With a terrifying surge of desperate adrenaline-fueled strength, he hoisted the massive chair over his head. He let out another guttural roar, using the momentum to vault himself onto the mahogany table, charging directly at me with lethal intent. The heavy brass chair never even reached the apex of its arc. Before Gavin could fully launch his body across the expanse of the polished mahogany table, Wyatt moved. It was not a frantic scramble or a desperate block, but a terrifying display of explosive ex-marine precision. Wyatt was a sudden blur of calculated kinetic energy intercepting my husband mid-vault with devastating, unapologetic force. He did not simply push the attack away. He absorbed Gavin's chaotic momentum and violently redirected it. Wyatt's large hands locked onto Gavin's tailored Italian lapels and expensive leather belt, lifting him slightly off the table before slamming his entire body weight directly onto the unforgiving hardwood floor. The impact echoed through the glass-walled boardroom like a gunshot, accompanied by the harsh metallic clatter of the brass chair skidding harmlessly into a distant corner. Before Gavin could even register the air being violently forced from his lungs, Wyatt smoothly transitioned the brutal takedown into a joint-crushing submission hold. He pinned Gavin face down against the floorboards, driving a heavy knee directly between his shoulder blades while twisting his right arm into a severe high-angle lock. Gavin let out a sharp, breathless choke, his face pressed painfully against the wood, completely immobilized in a matter of seconds. The raw, animalistic rage that had possessed him was instantly extinguished by cold, unavoidable physical dominance. The speed and violence of the neutralization left the rest of the room entirely paralyzed. Thomas and Patricia stared in mute, suffocating horror as their untouchable, arrogant golden boy was reduced to a squirming, helpless captive on the floor of my sister-in-law's office. It was the exact visual catalyst required to completely shatter the very last remnants of their wealthy suburban delusions. The horrifying reality of their impending doom crashed down upon them with absolute inescapable finality. The fraudulent business loans, the imminent unavoidable foreclosure of their pristine estate, the total evaporation of their lifelong retirement funds, and the looming federal indictment hanging over their son all coalesced into a singular, crushing weight. Patricia physically collapsed. Her knees simply gave out and she dropped heavily onto the expensive carpet, the very picture of a broken, utterly defeated woman. The haughty, condescending sneer she had worn just moments ago was entirely gone, replaced by raw, ugly desperation. She crawled slightly forward, her hands clasped tightly together, her expensive pearls knocking against her chest as her shoulders shook with uncontrollable sobs. She looked up at me, her meticulous makeup ruined by tears, loudly begging for mercy. She abandoned all her previous arrogance, shamelessly citing the sacred bond of family. She wept, pleading with me to remember the holidays we had shared, begging me to think of Emma, and desperately asking me to halt the bank foreclosures so she and Thomas would not be left homeless and bankrupt in their twilight years. I did not flinch. I did not step back, nor did I reach out a hand to offer her even a fraction of comfort. I simply stood at the head of the conference table, maintaining my immaculate posture, and looked down at the weeping woman on the floor with absolute untouchable detachment. I watched her beg, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold clinical validation. She was attempting to leverage a familial bond that she had actively poisoned and undermined from the very beginning. I let her pathetic, frantic pleas echo in the silent boardroom for a long, agonizing moment, ensuring the sheer desperation of her display settled into the minds of everyone present. Then I delivered my verdict. My voice did not rise. It was perfectly level, stripped of all emotion, and struck with the devastating precision of a surgical scalpel. I looked down at Patricia. "You said my daughter didn't have the bloodline of this family. You were right. We are too good for you. I have no obligation to save garbage." Patricia let out a strangled, breathless gasp, her head dropping toward the carpet as if she had been physically struck by the words. Thomas squeezed his eyes shut, turning his face away to the glass wall to hide from the sheer humiliation of his wife's rejection. The absolute destruction of the extended family was complete. But the suffocating silence of the boardroom was suddenly pierced by a deeply unsettling sound. It started as a low, wet chuckle vibrating against the hardwood floor. It escalated quickly, building into a harsh, hysterical, completely unhinged laugh. Gavin, his face still pressed against the floorboards, his arm twisted agonizingly behind his back, by Wyatt was cackling. The sound was purely psychotic, the terrifying manifestation of a deeply entrenched narcissist whose ego had completely detached from his current ruined reality. Wyatt applied a sharp, punishing degree of pressure to the submission lock, but Gavin seemed to completely ignore the physical pain. He forced his head up, twisting his neck to look at me with a manic, bloodshot gaze. His facade had disintegrated, leaving behind nothing but pure, scorched earth malice. He stopped laughing just long enough to spit out his final, venomous revelation. He gloated that my perfectly executed trap was too late to keep his destruction quiet. He revealed that before the digital walls closed in on his offshore accounts, he had used his very last ounce of executive leverage and capital to secure a premier VYP spot at tonight's highly publicized Elite Tech Innovators Gala. The event was the most heavily attended industry summit of the year, packed with global media and international stakeholders. He bared his teeth in a vicious, terrifying smile, promising that before the federal agents could ever process his arrest warrant, he was going to walk straight into that ballroom and unleash a fabricated, catastrophic narrative about my firm to the entire industry, intending to completely annihilate my reputation in front of every major investor on the eastern seaboard before going down in flames. The manic, unhinged laughter vibrating from Gavin's throat slowly dissolved into a smug, breathless rasp. He pressed his bruised cheek against the hardwood floor and gasped out the harsh, bureaucratic reality of our situation. He was a white-collar criminal who understood the glacial grinding gears of the federal justice system perfectly. He choked out the fact that while Jada possessed all the damning forensic evidence, the FBI and the Department of Justice required a minimum of 4 hours to officially process the paperwork, secure a federal judge's signature, and mobilize a specialized seizure team. Until that ink was dry and the arrest warrant was formally entered into the national database, he was technically a free man. He demanded that Wyatt release him, threatening to add false imprisonment and assault to his fabricated list of grievances against me. He knew we could not legally hold him captive in the boardroom without risking our own immaculate legal standing. I stared down at the pathetic man writhing under Wyatt's knee and gave a microscopic, almost imperceptible nod. Wyatt instantly released his grip, stepping back with lethal grace, though his eyes never left his target. Gavin scrambled to his feet, his breathing ragged but his toxic arrogance immediately surging back to the surface. He aggressively brushed the invisible dust from his custom Italian suit, adjusting his crushed lapels and straightening his silk tie with a sickeningly deliberate composure. He completely ignored his weeping broken parents still huddled on the carpet and shot a venomous glare at Chelsea before fixing his eyes entirely on me. He declared with absolute certainty that he was walking out of my building to attend the Elite Tech Innovators Gala. He laid out his final, desperate gambit with chilling clarity. He intended to leverage his VIP access to corner a syndicate of highly aggressive offshore investors. His plan was to rapidly pitch the stolen medical intellectual property and sell the entire fraudulent shadow company for a fraction of its projected value, securing an untraceable international cash transfer just hours before the federal freeze took effect. He shot me one last triumphant smirk, turned on his heel, and strode out of the boardroom, leaving a trail of absolute devastation in his wake. I refused to let him control the narrative for even a single second. The moment the glass door shut behind him, the boardroom transformed from an execution chamber into a wartime command center. If Gavin wanted a highly publicized, spectacular stage to execute his final con, I was going to ensure he received a flawlessly televised public execution. Jada immediately began firing off secure messages, utilizing her vast network of elite security and public relations contacts to secure our immediate unquestioned access to the highly exclusive, heavily guarded event. Wyatt moved with silent efficiency, coordinating our secure transport and mapping out the structural blueprints of the gala venue. I retreated to my private executive suite to shed the slate-gray armor of my corporate blazer. Tonight required an entirely different caliber of warfare. I dressed with meticulous, cold-blooded intention, stepping into an immaculate, custom-tailored power red evening gown. The vibrant, blood-red silk draped flawlessly across my silhouette, a garment designed not merely for elegance, but to command absolute gravitational dominance over every camera and billionaire in the room. I secured a tiny, nearly invisible earpiece deep inside my ear canal, linking my audio feed directly to Jada's encrypted data terminal. We moved out a synchronized, unstoppable force descending upon the city. The gala was hosted at a massive, state-of-the-art architectural marvel of glass and steel in the heart of the Innovation District. We arrived to a scene of absolute sensory overload. Sweeping searchlights carved through the night sky, illuminating the sprawling red carpet, lined with hundreds of aggressive media cameras and flashing strobe lights. We bypassed the chaotic press line, utilizing Jada's secured VIP credentials to glide seamlessly through the heavy security perimeter. Inside the grand ballroom was teeming with the absolute apex of Silicon Valley royalty, international venture capitalists, and foreign dignitaries draped in diamonds and bespoke tuxedos. The air buzzed with the low, continuous hum of high-stakes negotiations and the clinking of crystal champagne flutes. It did not take long to locate him. Gavin was positioned near the sprawling illuminated ice bar, completely in his element. He was surrounded by a tight, captivated cluster of wealthy foreign investors and a handful of hungry note-taking journalists. I maintained my distance, staying perfectly concealed within the shadows of a towering floral arrangement, and watched him work the room. He was actively spinning a tragic, deeply sanitized narrative, portraying himself as a visionary martyr. I could hear snippets of his polished, charismatic lies drifting over the ambient noise. He cast himself as a brilliant innovator desperately trying to escape the suffocating clutches of a bitter, insanely wealthy, and vindictive estranged wife. He fed them a fabricated tale of how I was using my massive corporate influence to maliciously suppress his world-saving medical technology out of pure, jealous spite. He played the victim flawlessly, shaking his head with manufactured sorrow while simultaneously hyping up the revolutionary capabilities of the intellectual property he had stolen from my own portfolio. He was selling the lie perfectly, his audience nodding along in sympathetic outrage, their pockets practically opening at the promise of his counterfeit medical revolution. I stood perfectly still in my crimson gown, a silent ghost, waiting for the precise moment to strike. The ambient hum of the gala suddenly shifted. The heavy, ornate chandeliers suspended above the crowd slowly dimmed, and the massive state-of-the-art central stage blazed to life with brilliant, focused spotlights. The room fell into an expectant hush as the primary event organizer, a prominent tech mogul, stepped up to the crystal podium. His voice boomed through the massive high-fidelity sound system echoing off the glass walls. He spoke enthusiastically of groundbreaking innovation disrupting the healthcare industry and pushing the boundaries of modern science. He then announced the evening's surprise keynote speaker, elevating the anticipation in the room to a fever pitch. The organizer called Gavin's name enthusiastically, inviting him to present his supposedly revolutionary medical tech to the eager, deep-pocketed crowd. Gavin's chest puffed out, a look of absolute untouchable victory washing over his face. He buttoned his suit jacket with a practiced, arrogant flourish, flashing a brilliant, charismatic smile at the erupting applause. He separated himself from his cluster of investors and began his confident ascent up the illuminated steps to the main stage. He bathed in the blinding glow of hundreds of flashing cameras, raising his hand to acknowledge the cheering crowd, completely and utterly unaware that his captivated audience was about to witness the spectacular broadcasted obliteration of his entire existence. The manic, unhinged laughter vibrating from Gavin's throat slowly dissolved into a smug, breathless rasp. He pressed his bruised cheek against the hardwood floor and gasped out the harsh, bureaucratic reality of our situation. He was a white-collar criminal who understood the glacial, grinding gears of the federal justice system perfectly. He choked out the fact that while Jada possessed all the damning forensic evidence, the FBI and the Department of Justice required a minimum of 4 hours to officially process the paperwork, secure a federal judge's signature, and mobilize a specialized seizure team. Until that ink was dry and the arrest warrant was formally entered into the national database, he was technically a free man. He demanded that Wyatt release him, threatening to add false imprisonment and assault to his fabricated list of grievances against me. He knew we could not legally hold him captive in the boardroom without risking our own immaculate legal standing. I stared down at the pathetic man writhing under Wyatt's knee and gave a microscopic, almost imperceptible nod. Wyatt instantly released his grip, stepping back with lethal grace, though his eyes never left his target. Gavin scrambled to his feet, his breathing ragged but his toxic arrogance immediately surging back to the surface. He aggressively brushed the invisible dust from his custom Italian suit, adjusting his crushed lapels and straightening his silk tie with a sickeningly deliberate composure. He completely ignored his weeping broken parents still huddled on the carpet and shot a venomous glare at Chelsea before fixing his eyes entirely on me. He declared with absolute certainty that he was walking out of my building to attend the Elite Tech Innovators Gala. He laid out his final desperate gambit with chilling clarity. He intended to leverage his VIP access to corner a syndicate of highly aggressive offshore investors. His plan was to rapidly pitch the stolen medical intellectual property and sell the entire fraudulent shadow company for a fraction of its projected value, securing an untraceable international cash transfer just hours before the federal freeze took effect. He shot me one last triumphant smirk, turned on his heel, and strode out of the boardroom, leaving a trail of absolute devastation in his wake. I refused to let him control the narrative for even a single second. The moment the glass doors shut behind him, the boardroom transformed from an execution chamber into a wartime command center. If Gavin wanted a highly publicized, spectacular stage to execute his final con, I was going to ensure he received a flawlessly televised public execution. Jada immediately began firing off secure messages, utilizing her vast network of elite security and public relations contacts to secure our immediate, unquestioned access to the highly exclusive, heavily guarded event. Wyatt moved with silent efficiency, coordinating our secure transport and mapping out the structural blueprints of the gala venue. I retreated to my private executive suite to shed the slate-gray armor of my corporate blazer. Tonight required an entirely different caliber of warfare. I dressed with meticulous, cold-blooded intention, stepping into an immaculate, custom-tailored power red evening gown. The vibrant, blood-red silk draped flawlessly across my silhouette, a garment designed not merely for elegance but to command absolute gravitational dominance over every camera and billionaire in the room. I secured a tiny, nearly invisible earpiece deep inside my ear canal, linking my audio feed directly to Jada's encrypted data terminal. We moved out a synchronized, unstoppable force descending upon the city. The gala was hosted at a massive state-of-the-art architectural marvel of glass and steel in the heart of the Innovation District. We arrived to a scene of absolute sensory overload. Sweeping searchlights carved through the night sky, illuminating the sprawling red carpet, lined with hundreds of aggressive media cameras and flashing strobe lights. We bypassed the chaotic press line, utilizing Jada's secured VIP credentials to glide seamlessly through the heavy security perimeter. Inside the grand ballroom was teeming with the absolute apex of Silicon Valley royalty, international venture capitalists, and foreign dignitaries draped in diamonds and bespoke tuxedos. The air buzzed with the low, continuous hum of high-stakes negotiations and the clinking of crystal champagne flutes. It did not take long to locate him. Gavin was positioned near the sprawling, illuminated ice bar, completely in his element. He was surrounded by a tight, captivated cluster of wealthy foreign investors and a handful of hungry, note-taking journalists. I maintained my distance, staying perfectly concealed within the shadows of a towering floral arrangement, and watched him work the room. He was actively spinning a tragic, deeply sanitized narrative portraying himself as a visionary martyr. I could hear snippets of his polished, charismatic lies drifting over the ambient noise. He cast himself as a brilliant innovator, desperately trying to escape the suffocating clutches of a bitter, insanely wealthy, and vindictive, estranged wife. He fed them a fabricated tale of how I was using my massive corporate influence to maliciously suppress his world-saving medical technology out of pure, jealous spite. He played the victim flawlessly, shaking his head with manufactured sorrow while simultaneously hyping up the revolutionary capabilities of the intellectual property he had stolen from my own portfolio. He was selling the lie perfectly, his audience nodding along in sympathetic outrage, their pockets practically opening at the promise of his counterfeit medical revolution. I stood perfectly still in my crimson gown, a silent ghost waiting for the precise moment to strike. The ambient hum of the gala suddenly shifted. The heavy ornate chandeliers suspended above the crowd slowly dimmed, and the massive state-of-the-art central stage blazed to life with brilliant, focused spotlights. The room fell into an expectant hush as the primary event organizer, a prominent tech mogul, stepped up to the crystal podium. His voice boomed through the massive high-fidelity sound system echoing off the glass walls. He spoke enthusiastically of groundbreaking innovation disrupting the healthcare industry and pushing the boundaries of modern science. He then announced the evening's surprise keynote speaker, elevating the anticipation in the room to a fever pitch. The organizer called Gavin's name enthusiastically, inviting him to present his supposedly revolutionary medical tech to the eager, deep-pocketed crowd. Gavin's chest puffed out a look of absolute, untouchable victory washing over his face. He buttoned his suit jacket with a practiced, arrogant flourish, flashing a brilliant, charismatic smile at the erupting applause. He separated himself from his cluster of investors and began his confident ascent up the illuminated steps to the main stage. He bathed in the blinding glow of hundreds of flashing cameras, raising his hand to acknowledge the cheering crowd completely and utterly unaware that his captivated audience was about to witness the spectacular broadcasted obliteration of his entire existence. Gavin grasped the edges of the crystal podium, leaning forward with the practiced intimacy of a seasoned statesman. He looked out over the sea of tech billionaires, foreign dignitaries, and hungry journalists flashing that blinding synthetic smile. He tapped the microphone twice, the crisp sound echoing flawlessly across the cavernous ballroom, and opened his mouth to deliver the greatest performance of his life. He began to weave his manufactured tragedy, his voice thick with calculated emotion. He spoke of the incredible adversity required to bring revolutionary medical technology to the masses. He lamented the personal betrayals he had supposedly endured, painting a picture of a visionary leader fighting to save his life-saving intellectual property from the greedy, suffocating grip of a vindictive spouse. The audience hung on his every word, completely captivated by the illusion of his martyrdom. He raised his hand, gesturing broadly as he prepared to deliver the grand thesis of his pitch. But the words never reached the speakers. Mid-syllable, the audio feed died. A sharp, jarring squeal of electronic feedback pierced the ballroom, followed instantly by absolute dead silence. Gavin frowned, his hands slapping against the side of the microphone. He tapped the mesh screen, his charming smile faltering for a fraction of a second. Nothing happened. He looked toward the wings, attempting to signal the audio engineers with a look of mounting irritation. Then the blinding focused spotlights illuminating him on the main stage snapped off with a heavy clack. The stage was instantly plunged into deep, disorienting shadow. A wave of confused murmurs rippled through the elite crowd as the ambient lighting of the massive ballroom dimmed to a dramatic theater-like darkness. Gavin gripped the podium, his silhouette rigid with sudden creeping panic. He had lost control of the room. Behind him, the colossal 50-foot LED screen that served as the stage's primary backdrop crackled to life. It did not display the sleek, rendered graphics of the medical prototype he had promised to unveil. It did not show his corporate logo or his glowing biography. Instead, the screen flashed blindingly white, forcing the audience to shield their eyes before adjusting to the harsh glare. A colossal, high-definition document filled the entire 50-foot display. It was a live, unencrypted feed originating directly from Jada's secure terminal. The document was an official, freshly signed federal arrest warrant issued by the Department of Justice. Every billionaire investor and journalist in the room could read the bold, stark lettering, magnified to the size of a building. The text outlined his impending destruction in inescapable, excruciating detail. The charges were listed in bold black ink: aggravated wire fraud, grand larceny, criminal embezzlement of federal funds. A collective gasp swept through the ballroom, escalating into a loud, frantic hum of shock as the crowd read the very last charge listed at the bottom of the warrant. The most publicly humiliating, scandalous detail of his double life was now broadcast to the entire industry: bigamy. Gavin turned slowly, his neck craning to look at the massive screen towering behind him. His jaw went entirely slack. The blood vanished from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified phantom trapped in the harsh white glow of his own federal indictment. He was mathematically, legally, and publicly ruined. At the absolute back of the grand ballroom, the heavy oak doors swung open with a resounding thud. The spotlight operator, fully coordinated by Wyatt's earlier security sweep, redirected a single blinding beam of pure white light away from the stage and directly onto the entrance. The beam caught me perfectly. The vibrant, blood-red silk of my custom evening gown blazed like a beacon in the darkened room. I stepped forward into the center aisle. Wyatt and Jada flanked me, moving in absolute predatory lockstep. They projected an aura of lethal, untouchable authority, clearing the way as I advanced. The sea of venture capitalists, tech titans, and global media instantly parted, scrambling backward to create a wide, completely unobstructed path toward the stage. The absolute silence of the room returned, broken only by the sharp, rhythmic click of my heels against the polished marble floor. I did not look left or right. I kept my eyes locked dead onto the trembling, pathetic shell of a man standing at the podium. I ascended the illuminated stairs to the main stage with deliberate, unhurried grace. Gavin shrank back his hands, releasing the podium, as if the crystal had suddenly caught fire. He tried to speak, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish, perhaps attempting to formulate one last desperate lie. But Wyatt materialized at the edge of the stage, his imposing frame blocking any conceivable route of escape. His mere presence a silent promise of physical devastation if Gavin dared to take a single aggressive step. I walked right past my trembling husband without acknowledging his existence. I reached the podium and smoothly extracted a secondary fully active microphone resting near the base. I turned my back to Gavin, leaving him to cower in the shadow of his own arrest warrant, and faced the sea of shocked faces. Hundreds of camera flashes erupted, bathing the room in a staccato rhythm of blinding light as the media frantically documented the hostile takeover. I spoke with absolute icy clarity, my voice echoing flawlessly through the high-fidelity sound system. I introduced myself to the industry elite not as a bitter, estranged wife, but as the sole uncontested legal owner of the medical intellectual property they had just been pitched. I formally announced the immediate, unceremonious termination of the fraudulent CEO standing behind me, citing gross criminal misconduct, corporate espionage, and impending federal incarceration. I let the weight of the termination settle over the crowd, watching the wealthy investors rapidly recalculate their positions. Then I delivered the final crushing blow. I informed the stunned audience that the intellectual property was entirely secure. The corporate hierarchy had already been aggressively restructured, and the company was moving forward completely unhindered. I announced that just 30 minutes prior to walking into this room, my firm had successfully negotiated and secured a fully vetted $50 million Series C funding round without a single drop of his toxic involvement. The entire ballroom erupted into a deafening tidal wave of shocked whispers, frantic shouts from the press, and absolute unrestrained chaos. The entire ballroom erupted into a deafening tidal wave of shocked whispers, frantic shouts from the press, and absolute unrestrained chaos. I stood perfectly anchored at the crystal podium, letting the shockwaves of my announcement crash over the room. The sea of venture capitalists and tech royalty stared up at me, their expressions rapidly morphing from stunned disbelief to predatory calculation. The $50 million Series C revelation was the ultimate corporate checkmate, instantly re-establishing my firm's unshakable dominance and entirely neutralizing any residual leverage Gavin thought he possessed. Before the uproar could even begin to plateau, a sound sharper and more authoritative than the shouting sliced through the grand ballroom. The massive brass-studded oak doors at the rear of the hall did not simply open, they were thrust apart with bone-rattling force. A highly synchronized tactical unit of federal agents flooded into the venue. They moved with a terrifying unified purpose, their dark windbreakers emblazoned with the bold yellow letters of the FBI. Jada's expedited communications had done more than just secure a warrant. She had explicitly flagged Gavin as a high-level international flight risk, attempting to liquidate stolen corporate assets to foreign entities. The response was consequently massive and unapologetically aggressive. The agents marched down the center aisle in a rigid V-shaped formation, their expressions carved from stone, instantly parting the sea of glittering elite. The ambient noise of the gala evaporated into a breathless, electrifying silence, save for the heavy rhythmic thud of tactical boots against the polished marble floor. From my vantage point on the stage, I watched the exact second Gavin's mind registered his total defeat. The manic, desperate adrenaline that had fueled his performance evaporated, leaving behind nothing but the raw, unadulterated terror of a cornered animal. The federal agents were closing the distance rapidly, their eyes locked onto their target, illuminated by the harsh glare of the 50-foot arrest warrant still projecting behind him. Gavin's survival instincts finally overrode his vanity. He spun away from the podium, abandoning all pretense of dignity, and made a frantic, pathetic dash toward the darkened rear wings of the stage. But his scramble was blind and reckless. In his desperation to escape the descending law enforcement, he completely failed to register the thick braided bundles of heavy lighting cables snaking across the back of the platform. His expensive leather shoe caught the heavy wiring mid-stride. He pitched forward with a strangled cry, his arms flailing uselessly as he crashed face first onto the hard wooden decking. The impact was loud, humiliating, and incredibly final. He did not even have the chance to push himself up before the lead FBI agents vaulted onto the stage. They descended upon him with practiced, ruthless efficiency. Two agents drove their knees sharply into his back, pinning him flat against the floorboards, while a third violently wrenched his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic ratcheting of heavy steel handcuffs echoed across the silent stage, locking his wrists together in an unbreakable bind. The sheer spectacle of the neutralization broke the trance holding the audience. Suddenly, the ballroom transformed into a feeding frenzy. Every billionaire investor and journalist in the front rows simultaneously raised their smartphones. The flash of hundreds of cameras strobed relentlessly, capturing every agonizing second of the Golden Boy's destruction. They recorded his ruined suit, his bruised face pressed against the dusty cables, and his absolute, unmitigated degradation. He was no longer a visionary CEO, he was digital content, a cautionary tale being live-streamed to the entire globe. The agents hauled Gavin roughly to his feet. His custom Italian suit was torn and covered in debris, his tie yanked askew and his hair plastered to his forehead with cold sweat. They gripped his biceps with unforgiving force and began frog-marching him toward the front steps of the stage, preparing to drag him right back down the center aisle. Their path brought him directly past the crystal podium, where I remained standing. As he was shoved past me, the last remaining shreds of his carefully cultivated charming persona disintegrated into pure toxic venom. He thrashed weakly against the grip of the federal agents, twisting his neck to bare his teeth at me. He spat a string of vile, guttural curses, his voice hoarse and stripped of all its former polish. He promised retribution, snarling that I was a monster, a cold-blooded sociopath who had ruined an innocent man. I did not flinch, nor did I raise my voice to match his pathetic hysteria. I simply leaned slightly forward, cutting through his frantic shouting with a voice as calm and cold as deep winter ice. I looked directly into his panicked, bloodshot eyes and delivered my final, inescapable verdict. I told you I'd tear it all down. Gavin let out a sound that was half sob, half scream, as the agents forcefully jerked him forward, marching him away from the stage and out of my life forever. The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind the tactical unit, sealing his fate within the unforgiving machinery of the federal justice system. The moment he was gone, the collective attention of the entire ballroom snapped back to me like a physical force. The media frenzy did not dissipate. It amplified, pivoting entirely in my direction. Dozens of reporters surged forward, pressing against the edge of the stage, thrusting digital recorders and microphones into the air. But the tone of their frantic questions had fundamentally changed. They were no longer looking at the scorned, betrayed wife of a disgraced executive. They were looking at a conqueror. The flashing cameras illuminated the power-red silk of my gown, capturing the image of a woman who had meticulously orchestrated the absolute annihilation of her enemies. The press screamed for comments, their voices overlapping in a desperate bid for my attention. They treated me not as a victim who had barely survived a corporate coup, but as a ruthless, brilliant titan of industry. I stood flanked by Wyatt and Jada, looking out over the flashing lights and shouting journalists, fully realizing that I had not just reclaimed my company. I had just executed the greatest, most spectacular corporate cleanup in tech history, and the entire world was absolutely captivated by the blood on my hands. The blinding, chaotic flashbulbs of that historic night eventually faded, replaced by the warm, golden glow of a quiet morning sun. 6 months had passed since the gala, and the relentless, suffocating corporate warfare that had defined my life was now nothing more than a closed chapter. I stood leaning against the polished glass railing of the sprawling, sun-drenched terrace of my new home. I had purchased the stunning, state-of-the-art modern lake house entirely in cash, establishing a private sanctuary miles away from the toxic, artificial world my ex-husband had forced us to inhabit. The massive floor-to-ceiling windows reflected the pristine, crystal-clear water of the lake, completely free of the shadows that used to haunt my every waking moment. This was no longer a house built on compromises or financial anxieties. It was a fortress of absolute peace designed exclusively for my daughter and the people who had proven their unshakable loyalty. The quiet hum of the morning was broken by the slide of the glass patio door. Jada stepped out onto the terrace holding 2 steaming mugs of black coffee and a sleek digital tablet. She handed me a mug, her lips curving into a sharp, deeply satisfied smile. The federal justice system had finally completed its glacial grinding work. She tapped the screen, pulling up the morning's top financial and legal headlines, and read the final verdict aloud. Gavin had just been formally sentenced. Despite his expensive, high-profile defense attorneys and his pathetic attempts to negotiate a plea deal by offering up non-existent accomplices, the judge had shown absolutely no leniency. He was handed a staggering 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. The charismatic, arrogant golden boy who had believed he was utterly untouchable was now nothing more than an inmate number stripped of his tailored suits, his stolen wealth, and his manufactured vanity. His digital walls had indeed closed in permanently. Jada swiped to the next brief, detailing the catastrophic collateral damage Gavin had left in his wake. The destruction of the extended family was absolute and entirely of their own making. Thomas and Patricia had lost everything. The bank had ruthlessly executed the foreclosure on their pristine suburban estate, completely liquidating their assets to cover the fraudulent business loans they had co-signed for their son. The haughty, condescending couple who had once looked down on me for lacking their supposed pedigree were now living in a tiny, run-down, one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city, surviving entirely on a decimated pension. Their wealthy social circle had completely abandoned them the moment the scandal broke. Chelsea's fate was equally severe. The offshore accounts Gavin had promised her were seized by federal authorities, leaving her to bear the crushing weight of the massive tax debts he had strategically accumulated under her name. She was currently working 2 grueling retail jobs just to keep the lights on in a cramped rental. However, I had drawn a strict line when it came to collateral damage. I had absolutely no mercy for the adults who had actively conspired to ruin me, but a child should never be forced to inherit the sins of a toxic father. Through an encrypted anonymous trust fund managed entirely by Jada, I had quietly ensured that Hunter's private school tuition was fully paid through his high school graduation. I turned my gaze away from Jada's tablet and looked down toward the expansive manicured lawn stretching out toward the water's edge. Wyatt was running across the grass, his large, imposing frame looking entirely out of place, yet perfectly at home as he chased Emma through the morning dew. He had hoisted her onto his broad shoulders, spinning her around while she shrieked with absolute unrestrained delight. The sound of my daughter's genuine ringing laughter echoed across the lake, a beautiful vibrating testament to the new reality we had forged. There was no more tension, no more suffocating expectations, and no more looking over our shoulders. Wyatt had transitioned from my tactical security asset into a permanent, irreplaceable fixture in our lives, a silent guardian who brought an undeniable sense of safety and joy to my daughter's world. I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the deep, profound sense of victory settle into my bones. I looked at Jada standing fiercely at my side and then back at Wyatt and Emma, laughing in the sunshine. This was my true chosen family. They were not bound to me by blood legal obligation or toxic manufactured tradition. They were bound by absolute loyalty, shared battles, and unwavering respect. I reflected on the long, brutal journey that had brought me to this terrace. I had not merely survived a devastating betrayal, I had actively weaponized it. I had taken the deceit, the gaslighting, and the calculated theft meant to destroy me and forged it into an untouchable empire. I had systematically dismantled every single person who thought I was weak enough to be made a victim, proving that the most dangerous mistake a narcissist can make is underestimating the very woman they attempt to discard. My name is Sloane, and I am the sole architect of my own destiny. If there is one fundamental truth you take away from my story, let it be this. Never apologize for demanding respect, and never hesitate to enforce ruthless, unapologetic boundaries against those who attempt to drain your light. Financial independence is not just a safety net. It is your armor, your leverage, and your ultimate weapon against manipulation. When toxic people show you exactly who they are, do not try to fix them. Burn their illusions to the ground and build your own empire entirely from the ashes. Thank you for walking through this fire with me. If my journey resonated with you, or if you have ever had to execute your own corporate or personal cleanup, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your own stories of survival and victory in the comments below. Never forget that your power belongs entirely to you. The most profound lesson from Sloane's journey is that true security comes from within, forged through financial independence and unbreakable boundaries. When betrayal shatters the illusion of a perfect life, it leaves behind the raw materials to build something much stronger. Blood and legal ties do not guarantee loyalty. Rather, true family is chosen through mutual respect and unwavering support during our darkest moments. Sloane taught us that we never have to remain victims of our circumstances, but can instead become the architects of our own rebirth. Take control of your independence today and never apologize for protecting your peace. Share your own stories of overcoming betrayal in the comments below.